Powerful men believe they can erase the past, but some mistakes refuse to stay buried. Years ago, a ruthless CEO had an affair with a black employee, a woman he discarded the moment she became inconvenient. Fired, blacklisted, and left to struggle alone, she disappeared from his world, along with the child he never acknowledged. Decades later, a young man steps into his company, ambitious and eager to prove himself. To the CEO, he is just another employee, another face in a sea of workers beneath him. But as their paths cross, unease creeps in. Something about him feels familiar, too familiar. Before long, the cracks in his perfect life begin to widen, secrets unravel. The son he abandoned has come back, not with vengeance, but with the quiet certainty that truth cannot be ignored forever. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The city pulsed beneath the towering windows of Genesis MedTech, the glow of skyscrapers stretching endlessly into the night, their lights glittering like distant stars. Inside the executive office, the silence was thick, pressing against the walls like an unspoken threat. Naomi Carter sat perfectly still in the sleek leather chair, her fingers curled tightly together in her lap, her breath shallow but steady. Across from her, Randall Whitmore, the man she had once trusted, once foolishly believed in, remained motionless, his expression unreadable. The weight of her words had settled between them, and yet he hadn't spoken, hadn't even blinked. She should have known this would happen. She had spent nights rehearsing this moment, picturing every possible reaction, imagining him shocked, angry, even regretful, but not this unbearable silence. The longer it stretched, the colder the room felt. The man she had spent months with in whispered meetings and stolen moments was gone. The way he had once looked at her, with something that had almost felt like admiration, maybe even something deeper, that was gone too. All that was left was the CEO, the calculating businessman, the man who sat in his high-rise tower and dictated the course of others' lives with the stroke of a pen. He let out a slow, measured breath, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even. "And you're sure it's mine?" The words hit like a slap, not just for the insinuation, but for what they confirmed. There had never been trust, never been anything real. He was already searching for a way out, already trying to distance himself. The heat of humiliation burned at her throat, but she refused to let it show. She had come in here knowing she would leave alone. Yes, she didn't blink, didn't hesitate. Randall studied her, the way one might examine a problem that needed solving. She could see the calculations behind his eyes, the weighing of risks, the mental rerouting of plans. A child would disrupt his empire, his pristine life, his carefully constructed image. It was damage control. That was all this was to him. This isn't an option. Naomi's heart clenched, but she had expected this. She exhaled slowly, forcing steel into her spine, refusing to let the blow sink too deep. "You don't get to decide that." Randall tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp, assessing. "I have a family, Naomi." Her lips pressed together. She had known that, had known it the entire time, had known exactly what she was walking into when she let him into her life. But somehow, hearing him say it like this, as though it were a weapon, a barrier between them that had always been insurmountable, made something inside her splinter. "You think I don't know that?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I never expected anything from you, Randall. I didn't come here asking for help." His jaw tightened. "Then what are you asking for?" She let the silence stretch this time, let him sit in it, let him feel the weight of what he had done. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "I just thought you should know." Randall exhaled sharply, standing abruptly and walking to the window, his hands slipping into his pockets. His reflection was cast against the city lights, a towering figure of control, of wealth, of untouchable power. The man who owned this empire, who dictated the futures of hundreds, thousands, And yet, in this moment, she could see the truth of him. He wasn't afraid of losing her, wasn't afraid of losing their child. He was afraid of the consequences. He turned back to her, something colder settling into his expression. You understand that this can't get out. It wasn't a question. Naomi's breath hitched, but she refused to break. And if it does? Randall's lips pressed together, his fingers tapping once against the glass before he moved back toward his desk. You're smart, he said, and for a moment, she thought she heard something almost close to regret beneath the surface. But then he straightened his cuffs, smoothing his tie, and the moment was gone. Don't make this difficult. The warning was subtle, but it was there. Naomi's stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. Difficult? You think this is difficult for you? The words came out before she could stop them, and for the first time since this conversation started, something flickered in Randall's eyes, a warning. Naomi, he said slowly, deliberately, and she could hear the edge in his tone, the way his patience was thinning. We both know what needs to happen here. Something inside her turned ice cold. And what exactly is that? He hesitated only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to understand that in the few minutes they had been speaking, he had already made his decision. Randall Whitmore did not believe in consequences. Randall Whitmore believed in control. I'm sorry, he said at last, the words nothing but empty syllables, and he pressed a button on the intercom. Sharon, please notify security. Ms. Carter will be leaving the premises permanently. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Her breath caught. What? Randall didn't look at her. Effective immediately. Your credentials will be revoked. His tone remained smooth, controlled, almost indifferent. You'll be compensated for the next 2 months, but you will not set foot in this building again. A sharp, stunned silence stretched between them. Naomi felt her heart hammering in her chest, a mix of disbelief, fury, and something deeper, something breaking. You would do this to me? Randall's gaze lifted then, meeting hers with an expression so devoid of anything that for the first time she realized just how little she had ever known him. This is a business decision. The words hit harder than anything else. Not a personal one, not an emotional one, not even a necessary one. A business decision. There was a knock at the door. 2 security guards stepped inside, their expressions neutral, professional, as if this were nothing more than another routine task, just another disposable employee being escorted out of the building. Naomi let out a slow, shuddering breath, forcing herself to keep her head high, forcing herself to breathe. She would not give him the satisfaction of breaking. She refused. She stared at him for a long moment, memorizing his face, the coldness in his eyes, the unwavering arrogance of a man who had convinced himself that actions like this had no consequences. She wanted to say something, wanted to make him feel something, anything. Instead, she swallowed hard, exhaled slowly, and spoke only once, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't get to erase me, Randall. Then she turned, before her voice could crack, before the pain could take hold, and walked out. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, as the world she had built came crashing down, she made a vow to herself. One day, he would regret this. The cab ride home passed in a haze, the city blurring past her window in streaks of neon and headlights. The distant hum of life moving on without her, a stark contrast to the numb silence pressing in on all sides. The driver spoke at some point, a brief, unimportant question, something about the route, but Naomi barely registered it, barely managed a nod in response. Her hands remained clenched in her lap, her fingers digging into the fabric of her coat, as though holding on to something solid might anchor her, might stop the flood of thoughts from swallowing her whole. She could still hear his voice, still see the sharp finality in his eyes, still feel the weight of his dismissal settling deep in her chest, suffocating and immovable. This isn't an option. This is a business decision. The words echoed, cruel in their simplicity, devoid of hesitation, of uncertainty, of anything that might have resembled the man she had once believed existed beneath the carefully polished exterior. He hadn't faltered, hadn't paused, hadn't looked at her with even a flicker of regret. It had taken him mere moments to decide she no longer had a place in his world, mere moments to erase her from the career she had fought so hard to build, to cast her aside as though she had been nothing more than a mistake to be corrected. The cab rolled to a stop, the sharp jolt snapping her out of the spiral that had wrapped itself around her since she had left that office. She fumbled in her bag, her fingers clumsy and trembling as she pulled out a few bills, not even caring if she had overpaid, just wanting to get out, to step onto something solid before the suffocating weight inside her pressed her down completely. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment she simply stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the entrance to her apartment building, the familiarity of it feeling suddenly distant, as if it belonged to someone else, as if she no longer knew the version of herself who had left this place only hours ago. Somehow, she forced herself to move, her legs stiff and heavy as she crossed the lobby, her fingers barely steady enough to press the elevator button. The doors slid open, and she stepped inside, the air inside stale, the flickering fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead. Her own reflection stared back at her from the scratched metal walls, pale, hollow-eyed, the sharp lines of shock still etched into her expression. She barely recognized herself, barely recognized the exhaustion pulling at her features, the way her lips trembled slightly even as she pressed them together to hold back the storm, still raging beneath the surface. The doors opened again, and then she was inside her apartment, the familiar space stretching out before her in untouched stillness. The door shut softly behind her, and for a long moment she simply stood there, her bag slipping from her shoulder and landing on the couch with a muffled thud. The dim glow from the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the floor, the air still carrying the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser on the counter. The same scent that had always calmed her after long days, the same scent that had once meant comfort, meant home. But now it was nothing but a reminder of the life she had thought she was building, a life that had been ripped away from her in a matter of minutes. She had known Randall would react poorly, had prepared herself for anger, for denial, for the cold detachment of a man who had always kept his emotions locked away behind a carefully crafted facade. But she had not expected this. She had not expected him to strip her of everything, to pull the ground out from beneath her with such effortless ease, to take what little power she had left and crush it in the palm of his hand as though it had never mattered at all. Her breath hitched, the realization pressing down harder, and before she knew she was moving, she was sitting on the floor, her back against the edge of the couch, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them in a futile attempt to hold herself together. She had spent so many years fighting, climbing, proving herself in an industry that had never been built for her, had spent so much time believing that if she just worked harder, if she just excelled, if she just refused to let the world push her down, she could carve out a place for herself, could force them to see her as something more. But it hadn't mattered. None of it had mattered. One man had decided her fate, and with a few words, he had taken it all away, had reminded her just how little control she had ever truly had. Her hand drifted to her stomach before she even realized it. A quiet, instinctive motion, her palm pressing gently against the barely there curve, the life growing inside her still new, still fragile, still something she hadn't even had the chance to process before it had become a burden in someone else's eyes. She had gone into that office with the faintest sliver of hope that some part of him would care, that some part of him would recognize what this meant, what this could be. But he hadn't seen a child, hadn't seen a future. He had only seen a threat. A sharp, shuddering breath escaped her, and before she could stop it, before she could fight it back, the first sob broke free, jagged and raw, the sound echoing too loudly in the empty apartment. Her shoulders shook, her fingers curling against the fabric of her blouse, her breath coming in uneven gasps as the weight of it all finally crashed over her, unrelenting and unbearable. She had nothing. No job, no security, no idea how she was going to move forward from this. And worst of all, she had no one. Randall had taken everything, and she had no way to fight back. The dam inside her cracked completely, and she let it. There was no one here to see, no one to witness the way she folded in on herself, the way she let her grief, her fury, her sheer helplessness consume her. She let herself break, let herself sob until her throat ached, until her hands trembled too hard to wipe the tears away, until there was nothing left inside her but exhaustion and the distant, hollow ache of a future that had never been hers to control. She didn't know how long she stayed there, curled against the floor, her breath still uneven, her body still racked with silent, aching tremors. But eventually, her sobs faded into quiet gasps, and then those faded into nothing at all. She stared at the ceiling, her mind a blur, her limbs too heavy to move, and for the first time in years, she felt truly, utterly lost. The years had passed in ways that felt both impossibly slow and unbearably fast. The crushing weight of that night had never fully left her, but somehow Naomi had moved forward, had built a life out of the shattered remnants of what Randall Whitmore had taken from her. It hadn't been easy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but she had survived, had clawed her way through every struggle, had learned how to stand on her own, how to rebuild, how to keep moving even when the future had seemed impossibly uncertain. She had learned how to be a mother. The quiet stillness of the apartment had long since been replaced with something far more alive. The space had changed, growing with the years, evolving into something that no longer bore the echoes of grief and loss. It was smaller than the one she had once had, more modest, tucked in a neighborhood where life was slower, where people knew one another by name, where Elijah had been able to grow up with laughter in his voice instead of whispers of the past. And now, 22 years after that night, he stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space with an energy that was impossible to ignore, his face bright with unfiltered excitement, his eyes alight with the joy of someone on the precipice of something great. "Mom, you won't believe it. I got the job." Naomi had been sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a cup of tea, the warmth of it something familiar, something grounding, something steady in a way that so little had been over the years. The words hit her before she could process them, before she could understand why something in her chest immediately twisted, why her breath caught in her throat, before she even knew what he was about to say next. "Elijah, that's amazing." Her voice was automatic, but something inside her had already begun bracing for impact, had already started calculating, had already started scanning for the missing piece, the thing she hadn't yet heard. "I start in 2 weeks. Genesis MedTech." The mug slipped from her fingers before she even realized she had let go. The ceramic hit the table with a dull thud, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the edge, and for the first time in years, she felt cold. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Elijah's smile faltered, the sheer joy on his face dimming just slightly as confusion flickered in his eyes. "Mom?" Naomi swallowed hard, forcing her hands into her lap, pressing them together to keep them from trembling. "You—" Her voice came out wrong, thin and uncertain, but she cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You're going to be working where?" "Genesis MedTech." He hesitated, frowning slightly. "Mom, what's wrong?" The world had shifted, tilted, sent her spiraling back to a time she had spent decades trying to bury. It had been so long since she had spoken that name aloud, so long since she had allowed herself to think about that office, that man, that night. Randall Whitmore. The past had finally found her. "Elijah," she said, her voice quieter now, slower, deliberate. "You can't take that job." His brows pulled together, the lines of his face twisting in confusion, his hands still tucked into his jacket pockets as he stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. She had always known this moment would come, had always known there would be a day where the questions would come faster than the answers, where she would have to decide how much truth she was willing to give, how much she could afford to keep buried. But she hadn't been ready for it. Not like this. Not when he was standing there looking at her with his eyes, with the same sharp intensity she had once seen in someone else, the same quiet demand for answers, the same unshakable determination to carve a place for himself in a world that had never been designed to accommodate him. "I don't understand," he said when she didn't speak, taking a step closer, the joy from moments ago completely gone now. "Mom, I've worked for this. I've worked for this for years. And now you're telling me I can't take the job?" Her throat was dry, her pulse hammering so loudly she could barely hear anything beyond it. She shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You don't understand." Elijah let out a sharp, frustrated breath, running a hand over his face before dropping it back to his side. "Then explain it to me." She could see it already. The stubborn set of his jaw, the way his shoulders had squared, the way he was bracing himself, not for an argument, not for a fight, but for a truth he could already sense was coming. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Not now. "You just can't," she said finally. And even to her own ears, the words sounded weak, hollow, like something breaking apart at the seams. Elijah exhaled, tilting his head slightly as he studied her, as he searched her face for something she wasn't yet able to give. "I don't get it," he admitted. Quieter now, the frustration dimming just slightly, replaced with something closer to concern. "You've always told me to take opportunities, to fight for what I want. And now you're telling me to walk away from the biggest opportunity of my career without even explaining why?" She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, could feel the way the past was clawing its way back up, refusing to stay buried. She thought she had escaped this. She thought she had outrun it. She had been wrong. "Elijah, please," she tried again, softer this time, desperation creeping into the edges of her voice. "Just trust me." His jaw clenched. "That's not fair." And it wasn't. She knew it wasn't, but she couldn't tell him. Not yet. So she said nothing. And for the first time in a long time, the space between them felt like a chasm too wide to cross. Elijah exhaled sharply, pushing a hand through his hair before stepping back, his movements deliberate, controlled. "I'm taking the job." The words landed like a final blow, like something inevitable, like something she had no power to stop. And as he turned and walked away, the sound of the door closing behind him ringing far too loudly in the quiet apartment, Naomi remained frozen in place, her breath shallow, her pulse unsteady, the past finally catching up to her. The cold pressed against Elijah's skin as he walked, the night air sharper than he had expected, biting through his jacket and settling deep into his bones. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he needed space, needed to move, needed to shake off the strange, uneasy feeling that had wrapped itself around him ever since he had stepped out of the apartment. His mother's reaction still played on a loop in his mind, each moment replaying with the same weight, the same intensity, the same growing sense that something about all of it wasn't right. It wasn't just concern, wasn't just hesitation. It was fear, real, visceral fear, and she had refused to explain it, had given him nothing but a quiet, desperate plea to trust her, to walk away from an opportunity he had spent years working toward, without a single reason why. He had tried to push back, had tried to reason with her, had tried to make sense of it, but the way she had looked at him, the way her hands had trembled ever so slightly, the way her voice had cracked when she had said his name, it had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. But he wasn't going to change his mind. Not now. Not when he had fought for this, sacrificed for this, earned this. His feet carried him forward on instinct, each step a quiet, steady rhythm against the pavement, the city unfolding around him in streaks of neon and passing headlights. It wasn't until he rounded the familiar corner of 6th and Ash that he realized where he had ended up, the old cafe coming into view, its warm glow spilling out onto the sidewalk, the soft hum of music filtering through the glass windows. The sight of it eased something in his chest, just slightly. This place had always been his quiet escape, the one place he could come to clear his mind, to drown out the noise of the world, to think. He had spent years tucked into the same back booth, studying late into the night, sketching designs for medical prototypes on napkins, losing himself in the comfort of routine and familiarity. Tonight, it felt like exactly what he needed. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe washing over him, the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon wrapping around him in a way that felt grounding, steady, safe. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders before stepping toward the counter, already knowing his usual order, already reaching for his wallet, when another voice cut through the quiet. Black coffee, no sugar. And a brief pause, a glance at the menu. You know what? Throw in one of those almond croissants, too. Elijah turned slightly at the sound, his gaze landing on a man standing a few feet away, casually leaning against the counter, his jacket unzipped, the sharp lines of a tailored suit visible underneath. He was tall, well-dressed, carrying himself with the effortless confidence of someone who had grown up in rooms Elijah had only ever seen from the outside. But there was something about him that wasn't quite polished, something in the slight looseness of his tie, in the way he ran a hand through his dark hair, as though he had spent too much of the day thinking about something else entirely. The barista nodded, punching in the order, and as the man reached for his card, he caught Elijah's gaze, offering a polite nod before turning back to wait for his drink. Elijah didn't think much of it at first. Just another customer, another person ending their night with caffeine and quiet. It wasn't until the barista called the man's name that something flickered in the back of his mind, something that made him glance up just a little sharper, something that made his fingers still slightly over his own wallet. Daniel Whitmore. The name registered, but not in the way it should have. Elijah knew the name from his interview. He had met Daniel briefly, had shaken his hand, had thanked him for the opportunity, had spent the better part of an hour sitting across from him in a conference room, discussing the final steps of the hiring process. This was Randall Whitmore's son, the son of the man who owned Genesis MedTech. Elijah wasn't sure why the realization caught him off guard. Wasn't sure why. For just a fraction of a second, something inside him paused. But then Daniel turned slightly, coffee now in hand, eyes flicking toward Elijah as he offered a small nod. "You look familiar," he said, his tone easy, casual, the kind of confidence that came naturally to someone who had never needed to second-guess themselves. "Have we met?" Elijah hesitated for only half a second before offering his hand. "Elijah Carter. We met during my final interview at Genesis." Something passed over Daniel's face. Recognition, something like approval, maybe even amusement. "Right," he said, shaking his hand, his grip firm, assured. "I remember now. You're the one who impressed the hell out of our head of R&D. They wouldn't shut up about you." Elijah let out a small breath of a laugh, some of the tension inside him loosening. "I'll take that as a good sign." Daniel smirked slightly, taking a sip of his coffee before nodding toward the door. "You start in 2 weeks, yeah?" Elijah nodded. "Good," Daniel said, stepping past him, the door swinging open as the cold air rushed in once more. "Try not to make me look bad. The last thing I need is my father breathing down my neck about how I hired the wrong guy." And just like that, he was gone. Elijah stood there for a moment, still feeling the warmth of the handshake, still feeling the odd sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. He didn't know what he had expected from Randall Whitmore's son, but it hadn't been that. Something about Daniel seemed different, unpolished in a way that made him seem real. And for the first time since that conversation with his mother, the tightness in Elijah's chest eased just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this job was exactly where he was supposed to be. Back at the apartment, Naomi felt her chest tighten, something heavy pressing against her ribs, making it impossible to breathe. She had tried to stop him, tried to keep her voice steady, tried to make him listen without telling him the truth, but she had seen the frustration in his eyes, the quiet disbelief, the way his shoulders had tensed at the weight of a decision he didn't understand. She had never asked him to give up on something before, never told him to turn his back on an opportunity he had worked for, and now, when she finally had, she had given him nothing. No explanation, no reason, just fear. She stood motionless, staring at the door long after he was gone, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her, thick and suffocating. He wasn't supposed to know. He wasn't supposed to ever know. She had buried this part of her life so deeply, convinced herself that it would never touch him, that as long as she kept moving forward, the past would stay where it belonged. But Randall Whitmore had found a way back in. Her legs felt unsteady as she made her way to the kitchen, hands moving automatically, reaching for the kettle, for the mug she had abandoned earlier, for something familiar to keep herself from unraveling completely. The simple motions steadied her, gave her something to focus on, something that wasn't the thought of Elijah walking into that building, that world, that man's presence. But just as she reached for the mug, her fingers slipped, and the ceramic tumbled from her grasp, shattering against the tile floor. She froze, staring at the broken pieces, her breath caught in her throat. Everything she had built, everything she had protected, was beginning to crack. Her hands trembled as she crouched down, collecting the shards carefully, her fingers tightening around them until she could feel the edges pressing into her skin. The tea had spread across the floor, pooling around her knees, soaking into the sleeves of her sweater, but she barely noticed. Her mind was somewhere else, tangled in the past, replaying every moment that had led her here, every choice she had made, every door that had been slammed in her face because of him. There had been a time when she believed talent and ambition would be enough. She had spent years proving herself, fighting for every step forward, navigating the unspoken rules of corporate life, learning how to move in a world that had never been designed for her. She had done everything right, worked harder than everyone else, stayed later, said less, took up just enough space to be noticed, but never enough to be seen as a threat. And still, it hadn't mattered. Randall had erased her as if she had never existed. She could still remember the first rejection email, the way her stomach had twisted at the words, the polite dismissal, the vague reasoning, then the next, and the next. Soon, calls stopped coming. Recommendations she had once relied on had disappeared, and just like that, the career she had spent years building had vanished. Randall had made sure she had nowhere to go. By the time Elijah was born, she had taken any job she could find, administrative work, temp positions, anything that would keep the lights on. The weight of exhaustion had followed her everywhere, settling into her bones as she worked long hours for wages that barely stretched far enough. She had learned how to survive on next to nothing, learned how to navigate a life where the future was always uncertain, learned how to fight for something better. And she had rebuilt. She had raised Elijah to believe in himself, to reach for things she had been denied, to carve out a future where his talent and ambition would take him anywhere he wanted to go. And now, that future was leading him straight into Randall's world. She pressed a hand to her forehead, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to force her mind into something logical, something actionable. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet, not like this. But she couldn't let him walk into that company without knowing what Randall was capable of, without preparing him for the kind of man he was. She didn't have a choice anymore. Whatever happened next, she had to be ready. Naomi had barely slept. She had spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through every possible scenario, every potential way this conversation could go, every word she might say to make him listen. But no matter how many times she went over it in her head, the same obstacles remained. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. And without the truth, what could she possibly say to convince him to walk away from the thing he had worked so hard for? By the time morning arrived, exhaustion clung to her, pressing down on her limbs, but she forced herself up, moving through the motions of getting ready, trying to push away the unease that had settled into her bones. The apartment was quiet. Elijah hadn't come home last night, not unusual for him when he needed space, but something about it sat wrong with her today. She tried not to let it bother her. He would be back, and when he was, she would fix this. The hours stretched, the afternoon passed. She sat at the kitchen table, waiting, staring at the phone, at the door, at the inevitable confrontation that was coming. Then, the lock turned, the door swung open, and Elijah walked in. Naomi sat up, exhaling slightly, bracing herself as he stepped inside, shaking off the cold, moving through the apartment like he hadn't spent the last 24 hours avoiding her. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set, his movements careful, measured. "Elijah," she said carefully, her voice softer than she intended. "We need to talk." He didn't stop moving, didn't slow. He walked past her, heading toward the kitchen, pulling open the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water before finally turning back to face her. His expression was guarded, but there was something else underneath. Frustration, disappointment, maybe even hurt. Naomi swallowed. "Please," she said again, "just sit with me for a minute." Elijah hesitated. Then, finally, with a slow exhale, he stepped toward the table, pulling out a chair, lowering himself into it with the kind of tension that made it clear he didn't want to be here, that he was already bracing himself for another fight. She studied him for a moment, taking in the exhaustion around his eyes, the slight furrow in his brow, the way his shoulders remained stiff, like he was holding himself back. "I know you're upset," she said finally, her voice even, careful. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly. "Upset? No, Mom. I'm just completely confused." His hands curled around the water bottle, tapping against the plastic absent-mindedly, the restless energy radiating off him. "You've always told me to fight for what I want, to work hard, to take every opportunity that comes my way. And now, I tell you, I got my dream job, and you," he exhaled sharply, shaking his head again, "you're asking me to turn it down without even telling me why." Naomi's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I wouldn't ask you if it wasn't important." "Then tell me why," he pushed, leaning forward, his voice still controlled but tinged with frustration. "Just tell me, and I swear I'll listen." "But you won't. You're just telling me no. Like I'm a kid who doesn't understand the world, like I haven't spent years working for this." He let out another sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "Do you know how much it meant to me to get that offer? To know that I had actually made it? And now, instead of celebrating with me, you're acting like—" He stopped, shaking his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I don't get it. I don't get why you're doing this." Naomi looked down for a moment, inhaling slowly before lifting her gaze to meet his again. "I know how much this means to you. Then why? I just need you to trust me." Elijah's expression hardened slightly. "You already said that. And you know that's not fair." She knew. She knew he had every right to be upset. Knew she was asking him for something impossible. Knew she was breaking every rule she had set for their relationship over the years. She had always been open with him, had never kept things from him, had always made sure that he knew he was never alone, that she would always tell him the truth. And now, when it mattered most, she was failing him. She had nothing to give him, nothing except her fear. And that wasn't enough. "Elijah!" "No," he cut in, pushing his chair back slightly, his movements sharp, tense. "I love you, Mom, and I respect you. But you're asking me to throw away something huge without giving me any reason at all, and I can't do that. I won't." He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I've worked too hard for this." Naomi felt her chest tighten. The words caught in her throat, everything she wanted to say trapped beneath the weight of a past she couldn't yet reveal. Elijah exhaled, softer this time, his frustration dimming just slightly, replaced with something closer to exhaustion. He stood, grabbing his water, shaking his head as he turned away. "I'm taking the job." The words weren't angry, weren't meant to be cruel, but they landed with finality. Naomi felt something inside her break, but she knew there was nothing she could do to stop him. Not yet, not without telling him the truth, and she wasn't ready for that. The towering glass facade of Genesis MedTech loomed above Elijah as he stepped through the revolving doors. The crisp morning air left behind, as the warmth of the sleek, modern lobby enveloped him. His pulse thrummed beneath his skin, not with nerves, but with something closer to anticipation. This was everything he had worked for. He had spent years chasing this moment, pushing himself through long nights of studying, through internships that had barely paid enough to cover gas, through every grueling step it had taken to get here. Now, standing in the very building that housed some of the most innovative minds in biomedical engineering, he finally felt like he had made it. The lobby was a masterpiece of corporate prestige, marble floors gleaming beneath the soft overhead lighting, towering glass panels stretching to the ceiling, sleek leather seating arranged in perfect symmetry. A few employees passed by, dressed in sharp suits, carrying files, moving with quiet efficiency, the kind of people who had spent years in places like this, people who belonged. And now, so did he. A woman with perfectly styled hair and a Genesis MedTech ID clipped to her blazer approached him with a practiced smile, holding a tablet in one hand. "Elijah Carter?" He straightened slightly, shifting his messenger bag on his shoulder before nodding. "That's me. I'm Claire, part of the onboarding team. Welcome to Genesis," she said, motioning for him to follow. "We've got a quick orientation set up for you before we introduce you to your department." Elijah fell into step beside her as she led him toward the elevators, the quiet hum of the office already settling into his bones, the subtle thrill of stepping into a place where real, meaningful work was being done sparking in his chest. Claire spoke efficiently, running through the standard procedures as they stepped into the elevator, her voice smooth and professional. "You'll be shadowing Dr. Merrick today. He's head of R&D and the one who pushed hard for you to be here, so you made quite the impression during your interview." Elijah smiled slightly at that, a small spark of pride settling in his chest. "Glad to hear it," Claire continued without missing a beat. "You'll also be getting your badge, system logins, and all that good stuff. HR will go over everything with you this afternoon. But for now, let's just get you settled." The elevator doors slid open to reveal the sprawling engineering floor, a space of glass-walled labs and open workstations, whiteboards filled with formulas and blueprints lining the walls. The entire floor pulsed with energy, the kind of place where breakthroughs happened, where ideas turned into reality. Elijah could already see himself here. Claire led him toward the security desk, motioning for the guard to print his badge. The machine hummed softly, a small beep confirming his entry into the system, and within seconds, his employee ID was printed. His name bold beneath the Genesis MedTech logo, Elijah Carter, Research and Development. As the guard clipped the badge onto a lanyard and handed it to him, a voice cut through the space behind them, smooth, authoritative, unmistakable. "What's the name?" Elijah barely had time to turn before he saw him. Randall Whitmore. He knew the man by reputation alone. The visionary, the mogul, the powerhouse CEO who had built this company into an empire. But standing here, mere feet away, Elijah could feel the full weight of his presence. Randall was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his entire demeanor radiating control. He wasn't just a CEO, he was the room, the kind of man who demanded attention without asking for it. The security guard turned the ID slightly so Randall could see. Elijah Carter. For the briefest moment, Randall hesitated. Elijah caught it. A flicker, a shift, something in the way his gaze lingered on the name just a second too long. It was so quick that if Elijah hadn't been paying attention, he might have missed it. Then, just as smoothly, Randall's expression returned to neutral. "Elijah," he said, his tone polite but distant, his gaze sweeping over him with the same practiced efficiency he likely used in every boardroom he walked into. "Welcome to Genesis MedTech." Elijah straightened slightly, meeting his gaze with confidence, extending his hand. "Thank you, sir. I'm excited to be here." Randall took the handshake, his grip firm but brief, his nod curt, his demeanor controlled. "We're always looking for new talent," he said smoothly. "Make the most of your time here." And just like that, he was gone. Elijah watched as he disappeared down the hall, his presence leaving the air feeling heavier in his wake. He couldn't quite place why, but something about that interaction had felt off, the hesitation, the way his gaze had lingered. But before he could dwell on it, Claire was already leading him down the hall, launching back into her orientation speech as though nothing had happened. Elijah forced himself to shake off the unease, pushing it to the back of his mind. This was his first day. He needed to focus. Whatever that moment had been, it was nothing. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The morning passed in a blur of introductions, department overviews, and the quiet hum of innovation filling every corner of the building. Elijah moved through the halls of Genesis MedTech, absorbing everything, feeling the weight of possibility settle in his chest. This was where ideas were transformed into reality, where breakthroughs happened, where he belonged. His badge hung around his neck now, a tangible mark of everything he had worked for, the culmination of years spent pushing himself towards something greater. He had imagined this moment countless times, had thought about what it would feel like to step into a company like this, to finally be taken seriously, to be surrounded by people who shared his drive. It didn't disappoint. The R&D floor was a sprawling maze of workstations, glass-walled labs, and half-finished prototypes, a space that pulsed with creativity, filled with the kind of minds that refused to settle for anything less than the extraordinary. Whiteboards lined the walls, covered in complex equations and half-formed ideas, and the air carried the faint scent of coffee, soldering metal, and the sterile undertone of fresh lab equipment. Claire led him into a spacious but cluttered office, where 3 researchers stood in front of a whiteboard, deep in discussion. They didn't immediately notice the new presence in the room, their conversation moving rapidly, overlapping, their ideas spilling out in quick succession. Claire cleared her throat, finally drawing their attention. "This is Elijah Carter," she said, gesturing toward him. "He's joining R&D. Be nice. Merrick's been hyping him up, and I don't want him regretting it." The woman closest to the board turned first, her sharp gaze landing on Elijah with an appraising look. Her stance was confident, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, the sleeves of her blouse rolled up like she was ready to dissect an argument at any moment. "Leona Patel," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I oversee testing and compliance. If something makes it past me, it's because it actually works, not because you hoped it would." Elijah grinned. "Noted." The next to step forward was a man in his early 40s, his glasses slightly askew, his lab coat sporting faint coffee stains, evidence of long nights and obsessive work. "Theo Alvarez, biochem. If it involves breaking things down to a molecular level, I'm your guy." Before Elijah could respond, another voice cut in from behind him. Smooth, familiar. "And I'm Daniel Whitmore. But we've met already." Elijah turned, surprised, but not entirely shocked, to see Randall Whitmore's son leaning casually against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He carried himself with the kind of effortless confidence that came naturally to people who had never once had to question whether or not they belonged in a room. But there was something else beneath it, something less polished, less rehearsed, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own presence, like there was a part of him that hadn't quite figured out where he fit. Daniel pushed off the door frame and stepped into the room. Didn't realize you were getting dropped straight into R&D. They weren't kidding about you making an impression. Elijah shrugged. I'd like to think so. Daniel smirked, motioning toward the crowded central workstation, where prototypes sat half-finished, a collection of diagnostic tools and surgical instruments in various stages of completion. Well, welcome to the lab. You're in the deep end now. Try not to drown. Theo scoffed. More importantly, try not to set anything on fire. That's happened more than once. Daniel grinned. Twice. Leona corrected him without looking up. 3 times. Theo groaned. You're all exaggerating. Daniel turned back to Elijah. You'll like it here. Smart people, questionable sense of humor, and just enough corporate funding to keep things interesting. Elijah chuckled, feeling the last of his tension fade as he took in the dynamic between them. He had worked with a lot of different teams before, had met people who were brilliant but distant, driven but cold. But this felt different. There was an energy here, something sharp but easy, something that felt less like colleagues and more like a group of people who had figured out how to make the impossible work. And then there was Daniel. Elijah had met men like him before, had spent years navigating rooms full of people who had been born into privilege, who carried the weight of their last names like an unspoken promise of success. But Daniel didn't seem to carry his like a weapon. If anything, he seemed to be doing his best to distance himself from it. That was unexpected. Daniel motioned toward the table again. Let's see what you've got, Carter. Elijah rolled up his sleeves, stepping forward. You might regret that. Daniel grinned. We'll see. The rest of the day passed in a blur of brainstorming sessions, hands-on work, and rapid-fire debates over design improvements and efficiency upgrades. Elijah threw himself into it, letting himself get lost in the rhythm of creation, of problem-solving, of pushing an idea until it became something tangible. He had missed this feeling. At some point, he and Daniel ended up in the break room together, grabbing coffee between meetings. Daniel leaned against the counter, stirring his drink lazily, watching Elijah with an easy but curious expression. So, you're in R&D, he said, tilting his head slightly. That means you're either obsessed with innovation or mildly unhinged. Elijah smirked. A little bit of both. Daniel chuckled, nodding approvingly. That tracks. They stood there for a moment, sipping their coffee, the conversation settling into something lighter, the sharp edges of formality fading. So, Elijah said, setting his cup down, why R&D? Could have easily walked into a corporate role. Made your life easier. Daniel exhaled, glancing toward the window, his smirk dimming just slightly. Could have, he admitted, but that's my father's world, not mine. He shook his head, leaning back against the counter. I actually like building things. Hate sitting in meetings, hate pretending I care about profit margins. This? He motioned toward the lab beyond the break room. At least this feels like it means something. Elijah studied him for a moment, sensing the weight behind his words, the quiet discontent beneath the carefully controlled exterior. He hadn't expected that. Daniel met his gaze again, smirking slightly. What about you? You gonna be the one who actually gets something past Patel without her ripping it apart? Elijah laughed, shaking his head. I'll consider it a win if I make it through the week without getting on her bad side. Daniel grinned. Good luck with that. The moment stretched for a second longer, something unspoken settling between them. Elijah hadn't expected to find a friend here, but maybe he just had. The weeks passed quickly, slipping into a rhythm that felt natural, as if Elijah had always belonged at Genesis MedTech. His work with the R&D team had taken on a life of its own. Long hours spent refining prototypes, debating adjustments, losing track of time in the way only true passion allowed. There was something intoxicating about being surrounded by people who were just as driven, just as obsessive about pushing the limits of what was possible. The work felt good, challenging, consuming, rewarding, in ways that reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. And then there was Daniel. What had started as a casual camaraderie had quickly solidified into something deeper. The long hours in the lab turned into late-night brainstorming sessions, which turned into grabbing drinks after work, lingering in the break room just to argue about which designs had the most potential, ribbing each other over the smallest of miscalculations. The more time they spent together, the more Elijah realized Daniel was different from what he had expected. Not just a CEO's son riding the wave of privilege, but someone who was fighting against it. Someone who wanted to earn his place just as much as Elijah did. It was strange how quickly they had fallen into an easy rhythm. But even as everything seemed to be falling into place, there was something Elijah couldn't shake. Something that lingered beneath the surface whenever he least expected it. It was Randall Whitmore. Since his first day, Elijah had only seen him in passing. The occasional hallway sighting, a glimpse of him in the upper-floor conference rooms, always surrounded by executives who hung on his every word. But each time their paths crossed, he could feel the weight of the moment, like something unspoken hung between them, something just out of reach. Randall hadn't acknowledged him since that first encounter, hadn't looked at him twice, and yet Elijah couldn't forget the way his gaze had lingered on his name. And then, almost 3 weeks into the job, it happened again. Elijah had just wrapped up a morning design meeting, lingering in the corridor outside one of the main R&D labs, when a familiar voice cut through the hum of conversation. Carter, his head snapped up, and there he was. Randall Whitmore stood a few feet away, perfectly composed as always, his dark suit crisp, his expression unreadable. There was no one else around, no buffer of executives this time, just the two of them in an empty hallway. Elijah straightened, nodding politely. "Mr. Whitmore." Randall studied him for a moment, a gaze that felt less like polite acknowledgement and more like an evaluation, something careful, something deliberate. "I've been hearing good things," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who was always in control. "Merrick says you're sharp, that you could do great things here." Elijah felt a flicker of pride, but kept his expression neutral. "I hope to." Randall's eyes didn't leave him. "You like it here?" Elijah hesitated briefly, something about the question catching him off guard. "Yes, it's exactly where I want to be." Randall exhaled lightly, nodding. "Then I hope you make the most of it. Careers like this, they can disappear fast if you're not careful." Elijah's stomach twisted slightly. Something about the way Randall said it, the sharp precision of his tone, the weight behind the words, the way his gaze held just a little too long, made his skin prickle. It wasn't just a passing remark. It was a warning. Before he could respond, Randall glanced at his watch, nodded once in a businesslike farewell, and walked away. Elijah stood there, rooted in place, the moment replaying in his mind, the unease settling into something heavier, something deeper. Why had that felt so pointed? Why did Randall care what he thought of this job? And why had the way he said careers like this can disappear felt so much like something personal? The question lingered, unanswered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, staying with him long after he returned to work, long after he left for the day, long after he found himself standing outside his mother's apartment that evening, unsure of what he was even going to say. When Naomi opened the door, she didn't bother hiding her surprise. "Elijah?" she asked, scanning his face, her brow furrowing slightly at whatever she must have seen there. He stepped inside, shoving his hands into his pockets, exhaling sharply before turning to face her. "I need you to tell me the truth." Her expression shifted in an instant. The wariness returned, the quiet fear he had noticed before, the hesitation in her posture as if she was already bracing herself for whatever came next. "Elijah," she started, but he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice tighter now, the unease still sitting like a stone in his chest. "No more avoiding it. No more telling me to just trust you. No more pretending like this doesn't mean something." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I met Randall Whitmore today, and he said something that didn't make sense, like he already knew me, like he let out a frustrated breath. forcing himself to meet her gaze. "What aren't you telling me?" Naomi's fingers curled slightly, her shoulders stiffening, her lips pressing into a tight line. He could see it happening again. The hesitation, the reluctance, the way she wanted so badly to hold it in. And for the first time, he understood. She wasn't just hiding something, she was afraid of it. Elijah's chest tightened, his mind racing ahead of him, already filling in gaps he hadn't noticed before. Already seeing the shape of something he hadn't been prepared for. "Mom," he said, softer this time. "Whatever this is, whatever you've been trying to protect me from, I need to know." Naomi's breath hitched. Then, slowly, she closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, he saw it. The truth she had spent 22 years trying to keep from him. The truth that was about to change everything. Naomi stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the back of the couch as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Elijah had asked her a question. The question. The one she had spent 22 years praying he would never ask. And now there was no way out of it. Her son stood in front of her, eyes sharp, posture tense, the last remnants of his trust in her hanging by a thread. She could see it, the way he was already bracing for whatever she was about to say, the way his mind was already working through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her pulse pounding against her ribs. "You don't want to know this, Elijah." Her voice came out quieter than she intended, uneven, already fraying at the edges, his jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I'm standing right here, Mom. I already know something's wrong. Just tell me." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling shakily, forcing herself to find the words, to force them past the fear. "It's Randall," she said finally, her voice tight, strained. "Randall Whitmore." Elijah barely reacted at first, as if he was waiting for more, as if she hadn't yet said anything that changed his world. "What about him?" Her fingers tightened against the fabric of the couch. "He's your father." The room fell silent. Elijah didn't move. For a second, it was like he hadn't heard her, like the words hadn't fully registered, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and something far more dangerous. And then it hit. His head jerked back slightly, as if the weight of the truth had physically knocked him off balance. "What?" Naomi forced herself to hold his gaze. "Randall Whitmore is your father." Elijah let out a sharp, disbelieving breath. Half a laugh, but with no humor in it. Just raw, stunned confusion. He shook his head once, stepping back like he needed more space, like just standing too close to her might somehow stop him from understanding this. "No," he said, shaking his head again, more forcefully this time. "No, that doesn't make sense." Naomi's chest tightened. She wanted to reach for him, to close the distance between them, to do something to lessen the blow, but he was already pulling away, already backing into the realization, already breaking. "Elijah," she tried, her voice soft, pleading, but he wasn't listening. He was stuck in it now, stuck in the unraveling, stuck in the storm of everything this meant. "You're telling me the man I work for, the man I just shook hands with, the man whose son I've been working with for weeks, he's my father?" Naomi swallowed hard. "Yes." Elijah let out a shaky breath, his fingers raking through his hair, his whole body coiled tight with disbelief, confusion, rage. He started pacing, muttering something under his breath, shaking his head, like he could physically reject the truth if he just moved fast enough, thought hard enough. "You should have told me," he said, his voice sharper now, accusatory, cutting through the air like a blade. "I had a right to know." Naomi flinched, something breaking inside her at the anger in his voice. "I was protecting you." Elijah let out another sharp, disbelieving laugh, turning to face her fully, his eyes flashing. "Protecting me? From what?" Naomi's throat felt tight, every part of her screaming not to say it, not to go there. But she had no choice. Not anymore. From him. Elijah stilled, his brows furrowed, the fury flickering just slightly beneath the confusion. "What do you mean?" His voice was quieter now, Still rough, still unsteady, but demanding answers. Naomi forced herself to breathe. I told him about you, and he fired me. The words landed between them like a hammer to glass, splintering the air, fracturing everything they had built between them. Elijah didn't move, didn't breathe for a second, as if the ground beneath him had just shifted. His voice cracked, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. He knew? He's always known? Naomi nodded, her heart aching as she watched the realization sink in. Elijah's breath came faster now, his hands shaking at his sides. And he didn't care? He just erased you? Erased me? Tears burned behind Naomi's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent years preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for this. I tried to fight it, she whispered, but Randall, he made sure I had nothing. No job, no career, no future in the industry I built my life around. I had to start over. I had to. Her voice broke, her hands curling into fists as she shook her head. I had to survive. And I didn't want you to grow up knowing that your father— She stopped herself, because she couldn't say it, couldn't bring herself to say what she had known since the night he had fired her. That Randall Whitmore had never seen them as anything other than an inconvenience. Elijah's hands were on his hips now, his breath uneven, his body wound so tight she thought he might explode under the pressure. So, let me get this straight, he said, his voice dangerously calm, like a man standing at the edge of something too big to contain. He fired you. He ruined your career. He made sure you had nothing. And now, 2 decades later, I walked into his company, shook his hand, and he just acted like I didn't exist? Naomi felt her throat tighten, the truth twisting inside her, sharp and relentless. I didn't want you to find out this way. How the hell else was I supposed to find out? His voice cracked, raw and filled with betrayal. Naomi took a small step forward, but he didn't back away. He stayed where he was, staring at her like she wasn't the person he had always known. For the first time, her son looked at her like a stranger. Elijah, she pleaded, her voice softer now, breaking. He let out a breath, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was shaking. He turned slightly, looking past her now, his head dropping forward, his hands on his hips, his breath still uneven. Naomi waited. She knew he could leave. He had every reason to walk out that door, but he didn't. Instead, after a long, heavy silence, he sat down. He dropped into the chair at the kitchen table, running a hand down his face, staring at nothing. Then his voice came again, quieter now, rough and exhausted. Tell me everything. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying herself as she watched Elijah lower himself into the chair, his hands still pressed against his temples, his mind undoubtedly racing through the sheer magnitude of what she had just told him. She had expected him to leave, to storm out, to shut down completely, but instead, he was here, still trying to understand. That, more than anything, made her chest ache. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She had spent years preparing for this moment, rehearsing the words, convincing herself that if he ever demanded the truth, she would be ready. But she wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. Elijah, she started carefully, I never wanted you to find out this way. I wanted to protect you from him, from all of it. His hands dropped from his face, and when he looked up, there was something raw in his eyes. Not just anger, but hurt. You keep saying that. His voice was quieter now, rough at the edges. That you were protecting me. But from what? From knowing? From the truth? Or from the fact that you never even tried to make him take responsibility? Naomi swallowed hard. I did try. Elijah let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. And? What? He just fired you, and that was it? That was enough for you to give up? Her fingers curled slightly against the wood of the table, her pulse quickening as she reached for the words, the right words, the ones that might make him understand. I didn't give up, she said finally, her voice firmer than before. I had no choice, Elijah scoffed. There's always a choice. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaling through her nose. He didn't understand. Not yet. Without another word, she pushed her chair back and stood, walking toward the small bookshelf near the window. Her hands found the old wooden box tucked behind a row of books, her fingers hovering over the lid for a brief moment before she picked it up and carried it back to the table. Elijah frowned slightly as she set it down in front of him. She opened it slowly, pulling out a small, slightly worn photograph. Naomi didn't say anything as she slid it across the table toward him. Elijah hesitated before picking it up. The moment his eyes landed on the image, his entire body went still. It was Randall, younger but still unmistakably him. And next to him, Naomi. It was from one of their old company retreats, back when she had still believed in him, still believed that what they had meant something. Randall was smiling. She was smiling. There was nothing secret about it. They looked like two people who belonged together. Elijah's thumb brushed over the edge of the photo, his expression unreadable, his breath slower now, deeper. How many more of these do you have? His voice was quiet, steady. A few, Naomi admitted. Not many. I didn't keep most of them. I didn't want to. Elijah stared at the picture for a long moment before setting it down carefully. Okay. Naomi exhaled, something in her chest loosening just slightly. Maybe he was starting to believe her. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. You could have gotten a DNA test. Naomi flinched slightly. Not because of the accusation, but because she had known this question was coming. Elijah leaned forward, his brows furrowed. Did you? She hesitated. No. His jaw tightened. Why not? Because it wouldn't have mattered. Elijah let out a frustrated breath. That's not an answer. Naomi's fingers curled against her lap. It is. You think Randall would have cared about a test? You think a court order would have changed anything? He had money, power, lawyers, and she shook her head. I had nothing. Elijah's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. You could have fought. And then what? Naomi's voice rose slightly, the years of buried pain finally cracking through the surface. You think I could have dragged him into a courtroom and won? I had no job, no connections, no one to back me up. He had already wiped me out of the industry, Elijah. What makes you think a judge would have ruled in my favor? Elijah clenched his jaw, looking away for a moment, his fingers tapping against the wood, his mind turning over possibilities that no longer existed. Naomi inhaled deeply, her voice softer now. I had to choose, she whispered, between fighting a battle I knew I'd lose, or focusing on what mattered. You! Elijah exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. His fingers drifted back to the photograph, tracing the corner lightly, his eyes scanning the image as if searching for something. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at her again. Do you think he knows? His voice was low, almost cautious. Like, really knows? Naomi hesitated, but only for a moment. Yes. Elijah pressed his lips together, exhaling through his nose. And he's just been pretending I don't exist. She swallowed hard. Yes. A muscle in Elijah's jaw twitched, and for a second, Naomi thought he was going to explode with anger, with frustration, with something neither of them would be able to control. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, running both hands through his hair, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to process something too big to hold all at once. This is insane, he muttered. I don't even know what to do with this. Naomi exhaled, her own exhaustion settling deep in her bones. You don't have to do anything. Elijah let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You really think that's an option? Naomi didn't answer, because they both knew it wasn't. Elijah had barely slept. Even after leaving his mother's apartment in the early hours of the morning, after walking for blocks without direction, after sitting on a bench in the cold just trying to breathe through the weight of what he had learned, he still hadn't been able to clear his mind. Randall Whitmore was his father, and Daniel Whitmore, his friend, his colleague, the person he had spent weeks working alongside, laughing with, pushing himself to keep up with, was his brother. The realization felt suffocating. He wasn't sure why that part of the revelation hit the hardest, why it sat in his chest like something toxic, something wrong. But it did. He had spent his whole life thinking it was just him and his mother, that they were alone in this world, fighting for every step forward, for every inch of security, while everyone else seemed to move effortlessly through life. He had never wished for another family. He had never needed one. But now, knowing there had been a whole other life out there, one that had always existed, but had never included him, something inside him twisted, dark, and bitter, and he had to go back to work and pretend like nothing had changed. By the time he stepped through the doors of Genesis MedTech that morning, his stomach was a knot of tension so tight it felt like it might snap. The building hadn't changed. The people around him moved just as they always had. Oblivious, efficient, belonging in ways he wasn't sure he ever truly had. He could hear Daniel before he saw him, his voice carrying from down the hall, laughing with Theo over something. Elijah turned the corner and found the team gathered in the break room, coffee cups in hand, talking easily, as if the world hadn't just split apart beneath his feet. Daniel caught sight of him first, flashing a grin. "Carter, thought you weren't gonna make it in today." Elijah forced his shoulders to stay relaxed, forced a smirk he didn't feel. "You wish," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head as he passed him a cup of coffee, as if they were just two friends, just two co-workers, just two people whose lives hadn't been permanently altered by something neither of them had ever known. Elijah took it, fingers curling around the warmth, even as his insides felt cold. He couldn't look at Daniel the same way. Not now. Not knowing what he knew. Because Daniel had everything. He had been raised with a father who claimed him, had been given a childhood full of opportunities, had walked into Genesis MedTech without question, without doubt, without ever having to wonder if he was supposed to be there. And Elijah had grown up with nothing, no father, no support, just a mother who had spent her entire life fighting to make sure he had a fraction of what Daniel had been born into. It wasn't Daniel's fault, but that didn't stop the anger from burning under his skin. Daniel nudged his arm slightly. "You good, man?" Elijah blinked, realizing he had been gripping the coffee cup too tightly. He forced a short nod, swallowing past the tightness in his throat. "Yeah, just tired." Daniel smirked. "That's what happens when you actually work for a living." Elijah almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. If only he knew. Later that afternoon, as Elijah worked in the lab, still struggling to keep himself from spiraling into the mess of emotions fighting to surface, movement from the far side of the floor caught his eye. It was her. The woman walked in with an air of confidence, effortless, composed, the kind of presence that could silence a room without trying. She was beautiful in a way that felt carefully maintained, not just by wealth, but by certainty. The kind of certainty that came from never having to struggle. Elijah knew who she was before anyone had to say it. Catherine Whitmore. Randall's wife. His mother had never spoken about her, never mentioned who she was, never said anything about the woman who had stood beside Randall all these years while he pretended Elijah didn't exist. And yet, there she was. She greeted the front desk staff with a warm smile, exchanged a quick conversation with one of the executives who had been walking by. There was no tension in her expression, no weight of secrets dragging her down. She was unbothered, untouched by anything messy or complicated. And then, a second later, Daniel appeared beside her, his grin easy, his arm draping over her shoulder as he kissed her cheek, greeting her without hesitation. Elijah felt his stomach turn. It was casual, comfortable, normal. A son greeting his mother, a family that wasn't missing anything. They laughed about something as they headed toward Randall's office, Daniel walking alongside her, so at ease, so unaware of the gaping hole in the world Elijah had just discovered. Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind raced, his body thrumming with a sharp, quiet fury that he didn't know what to do with. Randall had erased his existence, had built this life, this family, this perfect image, while Naomi had struggled to give Elijah even the bare minimum. Daniel had been given everything, and Elijah had been left with nothing. He had never wanted this, never wanted to know, never wanted to be part of the poisoned legacy of Randall Whitmore. But now that he did, he couldn't ignore it, and he didn't know what that meant yet. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to pretend like none of this mattered. Elijah knew the anger wasn't going to fade. It had been sitting in his chest all day, a slow burn turning into something sharper, something impossible to ignore. He had tried to focus on his work, tried to push the thoughts away, tried to remind himself that none of this was Daniel's fault. But it didn't matter. Daniel had a life Elijah had never even been considered for, and Randall had done it deliberately. Elijah wasn't sure what exactly he wanted to accomplish, wasn't sure how this was going to go, wasn't even sure if he could keep himself from snapping the moment the words left his mouth. But what he did know, what had settled into him like something unshakable, was that he wasn't going to keep his mouth shut. He had been quiet for 22 years. That ended tonight. By the time the workday was winding down, Elijah leaned against the doorway of the break room, watching Daniel finish off the last few sips of his coffee, casually scrolling through his phone like his entire world hadn't just shifted without him knowing. Elijah exhaled through his nose, pushing off the doorframe. "You doing anything after work?" Daniel glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Why? You finally admitting you're terrible at socializing and need my help?" Elijah smirked, even though nothing about this felt funny. "Nah, figured we should go grab a drink. My treat." Daniel studied him for a second, as if trying to gauge something beneath the offer, but then shrugged easily, tossing his empty coffee cup into the trash. "All right, Carter, but if you're paying, I'm ordering top shelf." Elijah let out a short laugh, even though it felt off, hollow, like something he was doing out of habit rather than instinct. They left the office together, taking the elevator down in silence, stepping out onto the bustling street where the evening crowd was just beginning to form. Daniel shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing over. "You got a place in mind? Or are we just wandering until we end up at the first place that serves overpriced whiskey?" Elijah's lips twitched. "I know a spot." He led them a few blocks down, to a quieter bar tucked between two towering office buildings. The kind of place that was low-lit, worn in. The kind of place people went when they wanted to talk, without the weight of corporate eyes watching them. Daniel didn't question it, just followed Elijah inside, heading straight for a booth near the back, stretching out like he had no worries in the world, completely unaware that Elijah had brought him here for a reason. They ordered their drinks, bourbon for Elijah, a neat pour of scotch for Daniel. The silence between them stretched just long enough for Daniel to notice. He raised an eyebrow as he picked up his drink. "All right, what's with the serious energy? You finally going to admit I'm better than you at this job?" Elijah scoffed, shaking his head, rolling the glass in his hand, feeling the condensation against his fingertips. He could feel the moment approaching, the moment where he would say it, where he would break something that could never be put back together again. And strangely, he didn't care. He didn't care what happened to his job after this. He didn't care if it burned every bridge he had built here. He wasn't going to keep this inside. He lifted his drink, but his eyes stayed on Daniel. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if you weren't a Whitmore?" Daniel snorted, taking a sip of his drink. "What? Like, if I was born into a normal family? Or if I was just some guy and not my father's kid?" Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Yeah, if none of this had been handed to you. If you had had to fight for everything." Daniel exhaled, swirling his scotch idly, not catching the shift in Elijah's voice. "I mean, yeah, I think about it. But it's not like I don't work for what I have. I don't sit in some office letting my last name do the heavy lifting. I've got to prove myself just like anyone else." Elijah let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "It's not the same." Daniel frowned slightly at the tone, finally noticing that something wasn't right. Elijah set his drink down, his fingers tightening against the table edge. "Must be nice, though," he said, his voice quieter now, rougher, having a dad who actually claims you. Daniel blinked, his brow furrowing slightly. What? Elijah exhaled slowly, the words sharp on his tongue, pressing against his teeth, demanding to be spoken. You don't even know, do you? Daniel leaned forward slightly, his drink forgotten. Carter, what the hell are you talking about? Elijah looked him in the eye, the weight of everything that had been buried for 2 decades finally breaking through the surface. I'm talking about the fact that we have the same father. Daniel went completely still. For the first time since Elijah had met him, there was no quick comeback, no easy response, just silence. And in that silence, everything changed. The bar felt quieter now, even though the hum of conversation and clinking glasses hadn't stopped. The air between them had thickened, something tense settling over the table, the weight of what Elijah had just said pressing down hard. Daniel didn't speak at first. He just stared. Elijah could see the exact moment the words started to register, the moment Daniel's mind caught up, the moment confusion bled into something else, something heavier. Then, finally, "No," Daniel said, his voice sharp, immediate, like his brain had rejected the thought before even considering it. That's not possible." Elijah exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his glass. "Yeah, that's what I thought too." Daniel shook his head, letting out a disbelieving laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're messing with me, right? This is some weird-ass joke, some initiation thing the team cooked up. Because if so, Carter, I swear." Elijah cut him off. "I'm not joking." Daniel's face hardened slightly, his easygoing demeanor slipping for the first time, his jaw tensed, and when he leaned forward, his expression was unreadable. "Then, prove it." Elijah had been waiting for that. Silently, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid out the worn photograph his mother had given him. The one with her and Randall, standing together, smiling, like there had ever been a time when things between them had been real. He placed it on the table between them. Daniel hesitated for a second before picking it up, his eyes scanning the image, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges. Elijah didn't speak. He just watched. The moment stretched, long, suffocating, unavoidable. Daniel's fingers pressed against the worn surface of the photograph, his expression slowly shifting from disbelief to something more complicated. Recognition, doubt, something that looked dangerously close to realization. He didn't say anything right away. Then, quietly, almost like he was speaking to himself, "That's my dad." Elijah felt something cold settle in his chest. Daniel's eyes flicked up, his gaze sharper now, but still laced with denial. "That doesn't mean anything." Elijah let out a short, humorless laugh. "It means a hell of a lot, Whitmore." Daniel's shoulders tensed at the name, his fingers tapping against the photograph like he was trying to make sense of something his brain refused to accept. "My mom?" He stopped, shaking his head. No, if this was true, I would have known. Someone would have told me. My dad wouldn't just—" Elijah's jaw clenched. "Wouldn't just pretend I don't exist? Wouldn't erase me like I was a mistake?" Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out, because there was nothing he could say. Elijah exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. The anger was still there, simmering beneath his skin, but there was something else now. Something more painful, something raw. "You think I wanted to find out like this?" His voice was quieter now, rougher. "You think I wanted to wake up one day and realize that my father has been living his perfect life with his perfect family while my mom was out there fighting for me alone?" Daniel swallowed hard, the sharp defensiveness on his face beginning to crack. Elijah pressed forward. "I had to hear it from my mom. You've had your whole damn life with him, and I had to hear it like some ugly secret. And the worst part?" He leaned in slightly, his voice almost shaking. "He knows. He's always known, and he just chose to pretend I wasn't there." Daniel didn't speak, didn't move. Because what was there to say? The denial was slipping. Elijah could see it. The edges of certainty fraying, the cracks spreading. Daniel inhaled sharply, looking back down at the photo, his thumb pressing hard into the edge, like he was trying to ground himself. Then, finally, his voice came. Quieter now, shaken. How do you know for sure? Elijah exhaled, his fingers drumming once against the table before he forced his hands to still. My mom told me everything. He was her boss. They had an affair. When she told him she was pregnant, he fired her and made sure she'd never work in the industry again. Elijah's voice was steady, but the anger was still there, buried beneath every word. She lost everything. He made sure of it. Daniel flinched. He knew his father was ruthless, but this? Elijah shook his head. She never took him to court, never fought him for money, never tried to ruin his life the way he ruined hers, because she knew he would bury her if she did. He let out a sharp breath. And now I work for him. Now I shake his hand and pretend like he's just some guy signing my paycheck. When the truth is, his voice broke slightly, and he didn't finish the sentence. Daniel sat back, his hands running down his face, his shoulders visibly tense. Silence stretched again, heavier than before. Elijah could see it in him. The wheels turning, the war waging inside. And for a second, just a second, Elijah thought he might say something defensive, might try to argue it down, to fight it. But instead, Daniel slowly leaned forward again, his expression no longer angry, no longer disbelieving, just lost. So, what now? He asked, his voice rough, like the words hurt to say. Elijah exhaled. He didn't know, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Randall Whitmore get away with this. Daniel hadn't spoken in minutes. The weight of everything Elijah had just said hung heavy between them, pressing down on the table, on the air, on the drinks neither of them had touched in a while. The usual ease between them was gone, shattered the moment Elijah had told him the truth. Elijah watched as Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, still staring down at the photograph like it might suddenly offer a different answer. Daniel stopped, shaking his head. I don't know what to do with this. Elijah leaned back, his fingers tapping once against his glass before he spoke. Yeah, welcome to my week. Daniel let out a quiet, humorless laugh, dragging a hand down his face before he finally looked up. His expression was tighter now, his usual easy confidence completely replaced by something uncertain, unsettled. I mean, how am I supposed to just accept this? His voice was quiet but strained, as if his mind was still trying to reject the possibility, still searching for some other explanation. I've known my dad my whole life. You're telling me he just, what? Wrote you off like you were nothing? Elijah's jaw tightened at that. Yeah, he said, voice even. That's exactly what he did. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I mean, I always knew he could be a bastard, but this is... He didn't finish the sentence, just rubbed the back of his neck, staring down at the table like his world had just tilted sideways. Elijah studied him carefully, reading the cracks forming in real time. He could tell Daniel wanted to fight it, wanted to tell himself that there had to be more to the story, that the father he had grown up with, the one who had shaped his life, given him his future, couldn't possibly be the kind of man who would do something like this. But he also knew Daniel wasn't stupid, and he had proof. The picture was still sitting between them, Randall's face frozen in time, next to a woman Daniel had probably never even heard of before today, a woman whose life had been permanently altered by a decision their father had made decades ago. Elijah's fingers curled slightly, his pulse thrumming harder in his ears, as the anger inside him simmered, sharp and controlled. Daniel sat back, running both hands down his face. Jesus Christ. Elijah watched him, waiting to see where he landed, waiting to see if Daniel would try to spin it, if he would make excuses for the man who had never been anything to Elijah but a name on a company door, waiting to see if Daniel was going to stand on the side of the life he had been given, or the one Elijah had been denied. But Daniel just let out another shaky breath, shaking his head slightly. I don't know how to make sense of this, he admitted. I don't even know what to think. About him. About He stopped, meeting Elijah's gaze, something unreadable passing over his face. "About you?" Elijah exhaled through his nose, the weight of that sentence settling in his chest. "Yeah," he muttered. "I don't know what to think about you either." Daniel let out a soft laugh, but it wasn't amused, just tired. Then, slowly, he picked up the photograph again, studying it, running his thumb over the edges before setting it back down. "So," Daniel said, voice quieter now, "you told me all this for a reason." Elijah held his gaze. Yeah, he had. Because knowing wasn't enough. This wasn't just about the truth. This was about what happened next. Because Randall Whitmore had spent 22 years pretending Elijah didn't exist, and Elijah was done letting him get away with it. Daniel studied his face for a long moment before finally sighing, shaking his head slightly. "This is gonna get messy, isn't it?" Elijah's lips curled into something sharp, something that wasn't quite a smirk. "Oh yeah," he said. "It is." The next morning arrived with a weight that hadn't lifted, pressing against Elijah's chest the moment he woke up, heavy and unshakable, settling deep into his ribs like something meant to stay. The walk to work felt different. The city moving at its usual pace, unaware that something had shifted inside him, that the man stepping into Genesis MedTech wasn't the same one who had arrived just a few weeks ago, bright-eyed, eager, thinking he was stepping into a future built on nothing but his own merit. He had believed in this place, in the work they were doing, in the people he had come to respect. And now every inch of it felt like a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep him complacent, keep him in place, keep him from realizing the truth of what he had stepped into. By the time he reached the R&D floor, the weight in his chest had only grown heavier, but he didn't let it show, his posture easy, his expression neutral, his movements as controlled as ever. The team was already in motion, voices carrying through the space. Theo scribbling something onto a whiteboard, while Leona muttered under her breath about inconsistencies in the data report. Daniel stood near the workstations, scanning something on his tablet, his usual relaxed stance still in place. But there was something off, something different in the way he carried himself, the slightest tension in his shoulders, the subtle way his grip tightened around the edges of the device he was holding. Elijah didn't hesitate as he approached, stopping just short of him, his voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't draw the attention of the others. "We need to talk." Daniel glanced up, his expression unreadable, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something calculating, something Elijah recognized all too well. "Yeah, we do." They stepped into one of the empty meeting rooms off to the side, the frosted glass panels shielding them from the rest of the team. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand dragging down his face before he leaned against the table, shaking his head slightly, his voice tight with something he wasn't used to feeling. Uncertainty. "Look, I don't know what you're expecting me to do here. But this isn't something I can just walk into my dad's office and casually bring up over coffee." Elijah studied him for a moment, measuring the words, watching the way Daniel's jaw tensed, the way his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "You were always going to talk to him about it." Daniel let out a short, humorless breath, shaking his head, his gaze flicking toward the ceiling before settling back on Elijah. "Yeah, maybe, but I don't know how that conversation is going to go." Elijah's expression didn't change. "You scared?" Daniel scoffed, but there was no real amusement behind it, just a sharp exhale, a flicker of frustration. "I don't even know what to believe yet." Elijah didn't move, didn't look away, didn't give him the space to retreat into uncertainty. "Believe whatever you want, Whitmore, but the facts don't change." Daniel let out another breath, heavier this time, his voice quieter, rougher, like the weight of it was finally settling in. "You want to know the truth?" He shook his head slightly, his hands pressing into the table as he leaned forward. "I don't even know who the hell my father is anymore." Elijah's chest tightened at that, a slow breath pushing past his lips as he watched Daniel struggle with something that should have been simple. He could see the war happening behind his eyes, the fight between the man he had always known and the man he was starting to see for the first time. Daniel exhaled sharply, his head tilting slightly before he finally straightened, his voice quieter now, something more final behind it. "All right, fine. I'll talk to him." Elijah's arms crossed loosely over his chest. "And?" Daniel met his gaze, holding it, something unspoken settling in the space between them, something that wasn't uncertainty anymore, but a decision. "And we'll see what happens." There was something in his tone that Elijah recognized immediately, something that meant this wasn't going to be just another conversation. Elijah nodded once. And just like that, the line had been drawn. Daniel Whitmore had walked into his father's office 1,000 times before, had stood in that space, in front of that massive mahogany desk, across from the man who had shaped every inch of his life, and never once had he felt like an outsider. But today, stepping through those heavy doors, his footsteps deliberate, his breath controlled, his chest tight with something he couldn't shake, he felt different. Randall was already at his desk, flipping through reports, his expression calm, detached, as if his world was exactly as it should be, as if nothing had changed. When he finally looked up, his eyes landed on Daniel with the same measured gaze he always used, the one that analyzed, assessed, made sure everything was in its place. "Daniel," he said smoothly, setting the papers down, his voice as even as ever. "Something you need?" Daniel took a slow breath, stepping forward, but making no move to sit. "Yeah, we need to talk." Randall gestured toward the chair across from him, but Daniel didn't move. He wasn't here to sit. He wasn't here to be his son. He was here for answers. Randall studied him for a long moment before leaning back slightly, his hands folding together, his expression unreadable. "What's on your mind?" Daniel exhaled slowly, the words settling into place before he spoke. "Elijah Carter." There was a pause, a fraction of a second where his father's eyes sharpened, where something shifted beneath the surface, something almost imperceptible, something cold, something controlled. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. Randall blinked, his expression smoothing out again, his voice effortlessly neutral. "What about him?" Daniel let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly, his fingers curling against his palm before he finally slammed the photograph down onto the desk. The sound cut through the space like a warning shot. Randall's gaze flickered down, scanning the image, his face unreadable. But Daniel knew him too well. There was something there, something in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers just barely twitched. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate, every syllable laced with something sharper than anger. "He's my brother." Randall didn't flinch, didn't react the way Daniel had expected, didn't even look surprised. He just sat there, as if none of this mattered. Daniel waited for him to speak, to say something, anything, to deny it, to admit it, to give him something to hold on to. Randall just exhaled slowly, steepling his fingers, his voice so infuriatingly calm that it sent something sharp through Daniel's chest. "You've always been too emotional, Daniel." Daniel's stomach twisted. Because that was it, wasn't it? That was all this was to his father. Just another problem to be managed, controlled, ignored. He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're never going to own up to it, are you?" Randall's expression remained steady, his voice flat, absolute. "I don't have to." And with that, Daniel knew exactly who he was dealing with. His father wasn't going to admit to anything, which meant it was up to him to do something about it. Daniel's chest rose and fell slowly as the decision settled in his bones. He turned without another word and walked out of the office, knowing that from this moment forward, everything had changed. Daniel walked out of his father's office feeling like something inside him had finally snapped into place. For years he had known what kind of man Randall Whitmore was. He had seen it in the way he ran his company, the way he made decisions with cold precision, the way he always knew exactly how to make people disappear when they became inconvenient. But this was different. This wasn't about business. This wasn't about some competitor he had crushed, or an employee he had cut loose without a second thought. This was about family. And Randall Whitmore had looked him in the eye and chosen to feel nothing. Daniel wasn't surprised. Not really. But that didn't mean it didn't change something. By the time he made it back to the R&D floor, his mind had already settled. He wasn't his father. He wasn't going to be his father. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't even sure if he wanted to be his son. He spotted Elijah near the corner of the floor, pretending to work. But Daniel could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he wasn't really looking at the data on his screen, just waiting for whatever answer Daniel was going to come back with. Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to him, his voice low, even, final. "I'm done with him." Elijah turned slightly, his gaze sharp, unreadable at first, but Daniel didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't leave room for doubt. "I don't want anything to do with him anymore." Daniel exhaled, his voice steadier now, like the words felt right in his mouth, like he had finally said the thing that had been sitting in his chest all morning. "Not after this." Elijah studied him carefully, his expression unreadable at first, but something about Daniel's stance must have told him everything he needed to know. His shoulders loosened slightly, some of the tension bleeding out of him, his gaze measuring, but less guarded than before. "You sure?" Daniel let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Never been more sure of anything in my life." He crossed his arms, leaning against the workstation beside Elijah, his voice dropping lower. "I don't know what I expected." Maybe some half-assed attempt to explain himself. Maybe even a lie. Something that made him sound like he had a reason for it. But he didn't even try, just acted like none of it mattered. Elijah let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, his fingers drumming against the table. "Because it doesn't. Not to him." Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "Well, it matters to me." Elijah's gaze flicked up again, something shifting there. Daniel exhaled, his voice quieter now, but firm. "I don't know what this means yet. I don't know how to figure it all out. But what I do know, I'm not pretending like this didn't happen. I'm not standing next to that man and acting like I don't know what he did to you, what he did to your mom. I'm not just going to ignore it." Elijah studied him for a long moment, like he was weighing whether or not he could actually trust this. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good." Daniel huffed out a breath, running a hand through his hair, letting himself lean back slightly. "So, what now?" Elijah smirked, but it wasn't a light-hearted expression. There was something sharp behind it, something that carried the weight of 22 years of silence, of being erased, of watching his mother struggle while Randall Whitmore built his perfect family and never once looked back. "Now," Elijah said, voice even, "we make him face what he did." Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding once, fully committing to what he already knew had to happen. Randall had spent his whole life controlling the narrative, erasing people, making decisions that no one could challenge. But that was about to change. And it was going to start with them. Elijah had spent his entire life learning how to hold things in. He had learned how to swallow frustration, how to push down the anger, how to pretend like the things he couldn't change didn't bother him because dwelling on them had never gotten him anywhere. But now, with Daniel standing beside him, no longer just some friend or co-worker, but his brother, no longer on the outside of the truth, but fully inside of it, that anger had nowhere left to go but forward. He wasn't going to let this slide. Randall Whitmore had spent more than 2 decades pretending like Elijah and his mother didn't exist, erasing them from his life as if they had been nothing more than an inconvenience to dispose of. He had built his empire, raised his family, enjoyed his untouched reputation, and Elijah had been nothing more than a footnote in a life he had never been given a chance to be part of. That ended now. Daniel sat on the edge of one of the work tables in the empty lab, arms crossed, brows furrowed as he processed everything, the last remnants of disbelief replaced by something harder, something colder. Elijah could tell he was still working through the weight of it, still trying to reconcile the man he had grown up with and the man he now realized his father truly was. But what mattered was that Daniel was here. He wasn't hiding from it. He wasn't walking away. He was ready. "So," Daniel muttered, exhaling as he glanced toward Elijah, his voice still edged with disbelief, but laced with something heavier. How do we do this? Elijah leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the table. We make him answer for what he did. Daniel scoffed slightly, shaking his head. Yeah. And how exactly do we do that? Because if there's one thing I know about my father, it's that he doesn't answer to anyone unless he has to. Elijah's lips twitched slightly, but there was no humor in it. Then we make him have to. Daniel studied him carefully, waiting. Elijah exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. He controls everything, right? His image, his reputation, the way people see him. That's what matters to him the most. Not family, not loyalty, not decency. Control. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. So we take that away. Daniel arched an eyebrow slightly, his expression unreadable. You planning on blackmailing the old man? Elijah shook his head. Not blackmail. The truth. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady. We make sure people know exactly what he did. Not just that he had an affair. Not just that he had a kid he never acknowledged. But that he fired my mom, destroyed her career, buried her just to make sure she wouldn't be a problem for him. We take the thing he spent 22 years protecting, and we burn it to the ground. Daniel exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face before shaking his head slightly. You're talking about taking down the most powerful man in the company, possibly one of the most powerful men in the industry? And you think that's gonna be easy? Elijah smirked, his gaze dark, determined. I never said it would be easy. But I'm not afraid of him. Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table as his mind worked through every possible outcome. Every way this could blow up in both of their faces, every risk. He had grown up knowing exactly what his father was capable of, had spent years watching the way he maneuvered around threats before they even had a chance to reach him, how he made people disappear from the industry, how he dismantled opposition before they even knew they were fighting a war. But this was different, because Randall hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for Daniel choosing Elijah over him. He hadn't planned for the son he had raised to turn around and fight for the one he had thrown away. Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, a half smirk pulling at his lips, even as something cold settled in his chest. Well, this is gonna be fun, Elijah chuckled, but the sound was dark, edged with something unrelenting. Oh, yeah, real fun. Daniel leaned back slightly, crossing his arms again. So, what's the move? We leak the story? Go straight to the board? Call a press conference? He smirked slightly, but there was no amusement in his voice. Or do we just show up at one of his country club events and let the guests know they're shaking hands with a fraud? Elijah tilted his head slightly, considering it. Too easy. And too controlled. He'd spin it, turn it into a misunderstanding, paint my mom as some bitter ex-employee trying to ruin his reputation. We need something he can't spin. Daniel's brows furrowed slightly before realization clicked into place, his expression shifting as the idea took root. His family. Elijah nodded slowly, the smirk returning, sharper now. His wife. Your mom. She doesn't know, does she? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Not a chance. If she did, she would have left him years ago. My mother is a lot of things, but she's not someone who would sit by and let him get away with this. Elijah exhaled slowly. Then we tell her. Daniel huffed out a breath, shaking his head slightly before meeting Elijah's gaze again. Something steady and unchanging settling between them now. You really want to do this? Elijah leaned back slightly, shaking his head once, voice firm. I have to. Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding, his expression hardening into something final. Then let's do it. The plan was set. Randall Whitmore had spent years building a life where the truth couldn't touch him, where he could make problems disappear before they became real consequences. But now the problem was standing right in front of him, and this time he wasn't getting away with it. The plan was simple, but the consequences wouldn't be. Elijah had spent years thinking that nothing could ever touch Randall Whitmore, that a man with that much power That much control, that much unchecked arrogance, would never be forced to face anything he had done. But now, standing beside the son he had chosen over him, the son who had spent his life believing in a man who wasn't worthy of it, he knew for the first time that Randall was vulnerable, and all they had to do was set the right pieces in motion. Daniel had been the one to suggest the approach, his voice even, his expression unreadable as they sat in the dim glow of a coffee shop that evening, hashing out every possibility. His mother was the key. Catherine Whitmore was the one person Randall couldn't control, the one person whose opinion actually mattered. And once she knew the truth, once she saw the picture, once she looked her husband in the eye and realized the kind of man he really was, everything would begin to fall apart. Elijah leaned forward, elbows resting against the table, fingers loosely interlocked, his voice low but certain. "She's not just going to believe us. Not right away." Daniel nodded slowly, exhaling through his nose, his expression still unreadable. "No, but she'll believe the proof." Elijah studied him carefully. "And you're sure she won't just cover for him?" Daniel let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head slightly. "You don't know my mother." His voice was quieter now, something almost distant in it. "She spent her entire life being the perfect CEO's wife, keeping up appearances, keeping the family name polished. But if there's one thing she doesn't tolerate, it's being made a fool of. If she finds out my father humiliated her like this, that he hid something this big—" He smirked slightly, but there was nothing amused about it. "She won't cover for him. She'll burn him to the ground." Elijah let that settle for a moment, letting the weight of it stretch between them before he finally nodded. "Then we make sure she knows everything." The next step was deciding how. Daniel could tell her in private, sit her down, walk her through everything, make sure she saw it before Randall had a chance to spin it. That was the safest option, the least dramatic. But the safest option wouldn't be enough. They needed Randall to see it unraveling in real time. They needed him to feel it. Daniel was the first to suggest it, his voice almost casual, like the thought had barely formed before he said it. "Charity gala." Elijah frowned slightly. "What?" Daniel leaned back, swirling his coffee cup absently, his smirk returning, but this time it was sharp, cold, deliberate. "My mom and dad are hosting a charity event this weekend. Big crowd, press coverage, a whole night dedicated to showcasing how generous and upstanding Randall Whitmore is." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Perfect place to drop a bomb. Elijah felt a slow grin pull at the corner of his mouth, something dark curling in his chest. "That's risky." Daniel lifted a shoulder in a lazy shrug. "So is working here when your last name is Carter. But you still did it." Elijah scoffed, shaking his head slightly, but he didn't argue, because Daniel was right. This wasn't just about telling Catherine Whitmore the truth. This was about forcing Randall to stand there, surrounded by his peers, by the people who respected him, by the people who had built him into the legend he thought he was, and watch his world start to cave in. No controlling the narrative. No quiet cover-ups. No more pretending like his past couldn't touch him. Elijah exhaled slowly, nodding once. "All right, let's do it." Daniel smirked, lifting his cup slightly before taking a sip. "Hope you own a suit." Elijah huffed out a short laugh, shaking his head. "I'll figure it out." The plan was set. This weekend, Randall Whitmore was going to answer for everything. Daniel had never been nervous to talk to his mother before. He had spent his entire life watching her navigate rooms filled with the most powerful people in the industry. Always poised, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Catherine Whitmore was not a woman who let emotions dictate her decisions. She was composed, sharp, the kind of person who made people nervous without ever raising her voice. She had spent years shaping the public perception of the Whitmore family, ensuring that Randall's name remained untouchable. But this was different. For the first time, Daniel wasn't coming to her for advice or approval. He was bringing her something that couldn't be fixed, couldn't be spun, couldn't be buried under polished statements and controlled narratives. And he wasn't coming alone. Elijah sat beside him in the car as they pulled up to the Whitmore estate, his posture tense, his hands clasped together between his knees, his gaze unreadable as he stared out the window at the mansion that had never been his. He had spent his entire life outside of this world, watching from a distance, never knowing that inside these walls was a family he had never been allowed to claim. Daniel hadn't asked him if he wanted to come. He had simply told him he should. Elijah hadn't hesitated before saying yes. They stepped inside, the quiet grandeur of the estate pressing down on them as they walked through the halls, the weight of history and wealth woven into every polished surface, every carefully curated piece of art, every inch of space designed to reflect power and legacy. Catherine was waiting for them in the library, seated in one of the high-backed leather chairs by the window, a glass of wine in her hand, perfectly composed as always. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves framed her like a portrait of control, a woman who had spent her life ensuring nothing slipped through the cracks. She glanced up as they entered, her gaze sharp, flicking between the two of them, taking in Elijah's presence without a single sign of surprise. "This is new," she murmured, setting her glass down on the table beside her. "You've never brought a guest before." Daniel exhaled slowly, stepping forward, hands slipping into his pockets as he met her gaze head-on. "This isn't just a guest." Catherine's brow lifted slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. Daniel pulled the photograph from his pocket, unfolding it slowly before placing it on the table between them, the worn edges curling slightly against the polished wood. Catherine's gaze drifted downward, landing on the image, scanning the familiar face of the man she had been married to for nearly 3 decades. But instead of dismissing it entirely, her eyes lingered on the woman beside him. Elijah held his breath, watching her, waiting for something, a flinch, a reaction, a sign that she already knew. She didn't, but she understood. Daniel saw the exact moment it clicked, the barely there narrowing of her eyes, the slow inhale, the way her fingers tapped once against the armrest of the chair. She leaned back slightly, gaze still on the photograph, her voice calm, even, but laced with something sharper beneath it. "Tell me everything." Daniel sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice steady, deliberate, giving her the full truth in a way no one had ever dared to before. He told her about the affair, about how Randall had fired Naomi Carter the moment she told him she was pregnant, about how he had blacklisted her from the industry, ensuring she would never work again in the field she had built her life around. He told her about Elijah, about the son who had been erased, the son who had been left to watch from the outside, while Randall built a family that didn't include him. Catherine didn't interrupt. She didn't move. She just listened. When Daniel finished, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, she reached for her wine glass, lifted it to her lips, took a careful sip, and set it down again with a measured precision that sent a chill through Elijah's spine. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was dangerously quiet. "So, he thought he could keep this from me." It wasn't a question. Elijah watched her, exhaling slowly. "Looks like it." Catherine nodded once, fingers still resting against the stem of her glass, her gaze distant for a moment before it hardened, sharpened into something Daniel had only ever seen when she was preparing to dismantle someone completely. She reached for the photograph again, her fingers grazing the edge as she studied it once more, her expression cold, detached, but beneath it, something sharper lurked, something closer to betrayal. She finally set it down, her voice even, but with an edge beneath it. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying 22 years of weight behind it. "We're going to make him answer for it." Catherine exhaled lightly, shaking her head slightly as if weighing every possibility, every move before it was made. "He'll try to control the situation. No matter how you present it, no matter what evidence you bring, he will not let it unfold in a way that he can't manipulate." Daniel nodded once. "That's why we're not giving him the chance." She looked at him then, waiting. "The charity gala," Elijah said, his voice sharper now. The moment before he gets on stage, he won't have time to spin it. He won't be able to clean it up. We take the moment away from him before he even knows it's happening. Catherine considered that, her fingers tapping against the armrest again, the silence stretching before she exhaled lightly. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "Not in the middle of the room." Daniel frowned slightly. "What?" She lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable but knowing, like she had already seen the moment unfolding before it had even happened. "You do it just before he gets on stage," she said, her voice carrying the smooth, measured cadence of a woman who had spent years orchestrating the perfect public image. "You don't give him a second to recover, to spin it, to gather himself. You let him walk into the moment believing he's still in control, believing he's about to deliver one of his carefully prepared speeches to a room full of people who admire him." She tilted her head slightly, her voice cooling. "And then you take that control away from him." Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing now exactly why his father had always feared her. She was ruthless when she wanted to be, and she was on their side. Elijah, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, letting Daniel take the lead, spoke now, his voice even, controlled, unwavering. "You're really okay with this?" Catherine turned to him, studying him for a long moment before nodding once. "I don't tolerate humiliation." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers still resting lightly against the stem of her glass. "And Randall Whitmore is about to experience exactly what that feels like." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "So that's a yes." Catherine lifted the photograph one last time before tucking it into her lap, crossing one leg over the other, already moving to the next step in her mind. "This weekend," she murmured, her voice smooth, steady, final. "We end this." Elijah stood outside the door of his mother's apartment, his knuckles hovering just above the wood, hesitating in a way he never had before. He had always been able to walk into this space without thinking, without pausing, without feeling like something had shifted between them. But now, for the first time, he felt different. The weight of everything he had learned, everything he was about to do, everything that was coming next, sat heavy in his chest, pressing down hard, making it harder to breathe, harder to think, harder to ignore the quiet voice in the back of his mind that kept asking if he was really ready for this. But it was too late to stop now. He knocked twice. A moment later, the door swung open, and Naomi stood there, her brows pulling together slightly as she took him in, as if she could already tell something was wrong. She stepped back, motioning him inside without a word. Elijah exhaled slowly, stepping through the doorway, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him, the same space he had grown up in, the same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet warmth that had always been there, a stark contrast to the world he had just come from. His mother didn't speak right away. She just watched him carefully as he moved toward the kitchen, leaning against the counter, bracing himself. "Elijah," she said finally, her voice soft, cautious. "What is it?" He exhaled, running a hand over his face, before shaking his head slightly. "I talked to him." Her body went rigid, her entire posture shifting in an instant. "Randall." It wasn't a question. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. Daniel confronted him. He didn't deny it. He just acted like it didn't matter. Like we didn't matter. He let out a short, humorless breath, shaking his head. No guilt, no regret, just cold, detached indifference. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, as if trying to steady herself, to push back something that had been buried for years. When she looked at him again, her voice was quieter, but firm. "That's who he is." Elijah's chest tightened, frustration creeping into his voice. "I know that now. But I'm not letting him walk away from this like it's just another inconvenience he can brush aside." He shook his head, the anger that had been simmering inside him all week finally finding its way into his voice. "He spent his whole life making sure I didn't exist, like I was some mistake he could erase, like you were nothing more than a problem he had to get rid of. I'm done letting him get away with it." Naomi inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Elijah, I mean it, he interrupted, his voice steady, unwavering. I'm not backing down. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed together, something flickering behind her eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, but something deeper, something heavier. Elijah, listen to me, she said finally, her voice lower now, more urgent. Randall is not just some bad man who made a mistake and moved on. He is calculated. He is ruthless, and when he feels threatened, he doesn't hesitate to destroy whatever is in his way. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I've seen what he's capable of. You think what he did to me was cruel? That was him taking the easiest way out. He could have done worse. Much worse. Elijah's stomach twisted, but he didn't waver. I'm not afraid of him. Naomi's gaze sharpened. You should be. Silence settled between them, thick and unyielding. Then, softer now, her voice almost breaking. Not from fear, but from something closer to grief. I spent my whole life protecting you from that man. I gave up everything to make sure you never had to be in his world, never had to be anywhere near the kind of destruction he leaves behind. And now you're willingly walking into the fire. She shook her head. Something fragile beneath the strength in her voice. That terrifies me. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tightening, because he understood. He knew what she had given up. He knew what she had sacrificed. And still, she had never once let him feel like he had less. Like he was missing anything. Like he was anything other than enough. But he wasn't that kid anymore. And Randall Whitmore wasn't just a shadow in the past. He was right in front of him now. And Elijah couldn't walk away from this. He reached forward, resting a hand lightly over hers where it gripped the counter. Mom. His voice was quieter now, steadier. I'm not doing this just for me. He held her gaze, something raw, something real settling between them. I'm doing this for you, too. Her breath hitched slightly, her fingers twitching beneath his, her gaze dropping for a moment before she let out a slow, heavy exhale, like she had been carrying something for far too long. And then, finally, she nodded. She wasn't happy about it. She wasn't relieved, but she understood. And she let him go. The Whitmore Foundation's annual charity gala was the kind of event that made headlines before it even began. Every year, the city's elite gathered in a ballroom dripping with excess, chandeliers glowing overhead, silver trays carrying champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most people's monthly rent. There were cameras flashing at the entrance, photographers capturing the arrival of the wealthiest and most influential, each guest stepping out of sleek black cars with practiced elegance, poised for the night ahead. Elijah had never been in a room like this before. He had spent years working toward success, years fitting himself into spaces where he wasn't expected to belong, but this was different. This was a world that had never been meant for him, a place that had been reserved for the family he was never supposed to meet, the father who had ensured he would never be seen. And yet, he was here, standing beside his brother. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, rolling his shoulders slightly, his expression smooth, controlled, the kind of face he had been trained to wear in rooms like these. But Elijah could see the tension beneath it, the rigidness in his posture, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. This wasn't just another gala for him either. This was the beginning of the end. Catherine had already arrived. She was somewhere inside, working the room the way she always did, perfectly composed, unreadable, not a single crack in the image she had spent decades maintaining. If Randall had noticed anything off about her, he hadn't shown it, but he wouldn't, not until it was too late. Elijah exhaled, adjusting his tie, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral, ignoring the feeling of walking through the front door of a world that had been locked to him his entire life. Daniel glanced at him, his voice low. Ready? Elijah's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. More than I've ever been. They stepped inside. The ballroom was exactly what Elijah had expected. Too polished, too bright, filled with too many people who moved through the space as if nothing in the world could touch them. People who had never fought for their place because it had been handed to them. Randall was across the room, standing near a group of executives, his presence commanding, his expression calm, his suit pristine, completely unaware that everything he had built was about to start slipping through his fingers. Elijah felt the anger press against his ribs, cold and quiet. But he didn't move toward him yet. Not yet. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice even, but edged with something sharp. "You see him?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Yeah." Daniel exhaled slowly, straightening, falling back into the version of himself that was built for rooms like this. "All right, let's get started." They made their way deeper into the crowd, moving through small clusters of conversations, exchanging polite nods where necessary, but their focus never shifted. The plan was already in motion, every step already set, every piece falling into place. Randall would take the stage in less than an hour, completely unaware that by the time he left it, he would never be seen the same way again. Elijah felt the weight of it settling in his chest, the slow, steady build of everything that had led to this moment. Tonight, Randall Whitmore was going to answer for what he had done. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. The Whitmore Foundation's charity gala had always been a carefully orchestrated performance, a night designed to reinforce Randall Whitmore's reputation as a visionary, a leader, a man admired by his peers and untouchable by scandal. The evening had unfolded as expected. Champagne flowed, speeches were exchanged, conversations filled with practiced charm. And Randall had moved through the room with the same ease he always did, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. Elijah and Daniel stood near the edges of the ballroom, waiting. Catherine Whitmore was already in position, playing the role she had perfected over decades. The polished, poised wife of a powerful man, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding. If there was any tension beneath her composed exterior, no one would notice. Randall was still unaware, still confident, still convinced that he was in control, but that control was already slipping through his fingers. As the evening progressed, the moment finally arrived. Randall's speech. The crowd had gathered, champagne glasses in hand, murmurs of anticipation running through the room as he made his way toward the stage. This was his favorite part of the night, the moment where he stood above everyone, where he reminded them why he was a name that commanded power and respect. Elijah's breath was steady as he watched him ascend the stage, watching the last moments of the life Randall had built before it all came crashing down. Catherine made the first move. As Randall reached the podium, she rose gracefully from her table, her movements deliberate, every step carrying the weight of what was about to happen. Conversations quieted as she approached the stage, the attention of the room shifting just slightly as people noticed her movement, curious, intrigued, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of something unraveling. Randall turned slightly, his brows lifting, caught off guard for the first time that evening. "Catherine?" Her lips curled into something polite but cold, a look that had been mistaken for admiration too many times before. She extended her hand toward him, and for a fleeting second, Randall still believed this was part of the show, until she handed him the photograph, until he looked down at it, until his face shifted just slightly, a flicker of something sharp flashing across his expression, a barely contained realization that this was not part of the plan. The room hadn't caught on yet, but Elijah could see it happening. Daniel took a slow breath beside him, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. Randall's jaw tightened. "What is this?" His voice was low, but Elijah could hear the sharp edge of unease creeping into it. Catherine didn't answer right away. She simply turned to face the crowd, her expression poised, regal, still composed, even as she prepared to deliver the final blow. "This evening," she said smoothly, her voice carrying across the room with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding attention, "we are gathered here to celebrate generosity, to honor integrity, to recognize the people who dedicate themselves to making the world a better place. Atharihi crowd was fully engaged now, listening, watching, sensing that something had shifted, that something beneath the surface was moving toward them. Randall hadn't spoken, hadn't recovered. Catherine's gaze swept across the room, landing on Elijah, not hesitating, not wavering, not giving Randall a second to stop what was happening. There is someone here tonight who has spent their entire life knowing what it means to fight for what they deserve, she continued, her voice smooth, unwavering. Someone who has worked tirelessly despite the odds stacked against them, despite the obstacles placed in their way by people who believed they were above accountability. Elijah felt the weight of it settle in his chest. She turned to Randall then, her expression hardening just slightly, her voice carrying just enough coldness that he finally realized what was happening. "Would you like to introduce your son, Randall?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that stretched across the room as the words hit. Randall's entire body stiffened. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Hushed whispers, heads turning, eyes darting between them. Randall did not move. Catherine did not break eye contact with him. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice clear, steady, sharp. "Or should I?" Randall's hands clenched against the podium. The room was falling apart around him, the murmurs growing louder, the weight of too many eyes pressing down on him, too many people watching, waiting. Elijah finally moved. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, making his way through the crowd, past the carefully dressed guests, past the people who had spent their lives admiring Randall Whitmore, past the people who had never once questioned the story he had sold them. And then he was there, standing before the father who had never wanted him, standing before the man who had erased him. Randall's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, as if he could still find a way to twist the moment, to control it, to walk away from it untouched. But there was nothing left to spin. Elijah exhaled slowly, his voice calm, even, but laced with 22 years of weight. "You can't ignore me anymore." Randall's throat bobbed slightly, his breath uneven, the mask of control slipping just enough for Elijah to see the truth beneath it. The fear, the rage, the realization that he had finally lost. And then, from the crowd, someone whispered just loud enough to be heard, "He has another son?" The murmurs turned into a wave, guests shifting, whispers spreading, the realization breaking through the room like a slow-burning wildfire. Randall Whitmore, the man who had built an empire on his image, on his flawless, untouchable reputation, had been exposed. Catherine turned to the crowd, her voice still measured, unbothered, cruel in its precision. "Looks like my husband had more to offer the world than he let on." The crowd reacted instantly, some horrified, some intrigued, all watching as Randall's perfectly curated world slipped through his fingers. Elijah didn't need to say anything else. He had already won. Randall had spent years pretending like Elijah didn't exist. But now the entire world knew the truth. The air inside the ballroom had changed. Tension hung thick, suffocating, pressing down on Randall Whitmore from all sides. The weight of too many eyes, too many whispers, too many pieces clicking into place in real time. The man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, ensuring his world remained polished and unblemished, now stood exposed, the truth unraveling in front of him. Too fast to stop, too loud to silence. Randall had not moved. His fingers gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles had turned white, his breath measured but uneven, his mind scrambling for a way out, for a way to turn the moment back in his favor. But Catherine was still standing beside him, her presence unmoving, an immovable force standing in direct opposition to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not soft. "This man," she said smoothly, turning slightly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing back on Randall with cold precision, "has built his career on integrity, on leadership, on the illusion that he is the kind of man worth admiring. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly, her voice taking on a quality that almost sounded like pity. Though everyone in the room knew better, but what he has always been best at, what he has mastered better than anyone else, is erasing people. Randall stiffened. She turned, facing him fully now, her voice sharp enough to cut. "That's what you did, isn't it, Randall?" she asked, her head tilting just slightly, her expression unreadable but merciless. "When Naomi Carter told you she was pregnant, you erased her. You fired her, destroyed her career, made sure she would never work in this industry again. You cut her out of your life and moved on like she never existed." She turned to the crowd again, her lips pressing together in a thin, calculated line before she delivered the next blow. "Like your son never existed." The whispers became outright shock. Randall exhaled sharply, jaw clenching so hard it looked like his teeth might shatter. He opened his mouth, his breath uneven, his composure slipping. "Catherine," he started, but she lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence, dismissing him like he was a petulant child. "No," she said, her voice colder now. "You don't get to speak." A murmur rippled through the room, uncomfortable, intrigued, watching a man who had always seemed unshakable suddenly look very, very small. Randall's breathing had turned shallow, his mind working too fast, too desperately. His entire reputation was built on how people saw him, and now he wasn't sure how they were looking at him. Catherine continued, unbothered by his unraveling. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't panic. You didn't make a mistake. You made a decision, a calculated, cruel decision." She paused, her voice dropping slightly, the disappointment cutting sharper than the fury. "And then you sat at my dinner table for over 20 years and pretended like you were a good man." Randall swallowed hard, his hands gripping the podium, his body fighting to stay upright against the weight of what was happening. Catherine exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I knew you were ruthless. I knew you were willing to do whatever it took to get what you wanted, but I never thought you were a coward." Randall's breath caught, his pride taking a direct hit. The word hung in the air between them. Undeniable. Coward. For years, Randall Whitmore had been described as many things: powerful, brilliant, ruthless, but never a coward. The crowd shifted, murmuring, watching, waiting to see if Randall would defend himself, but he didn't, because there was nothing to say. Catherine exhaled, turning to Elijah now. For the first time since this entire thing had begun, her expression softened. "Elijah," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "I won't stand here and tell you that I can undo what he did to you. I won't tell you that my silence was excusable, that I shouldn't have noticed something was wrong years ago." Her eyes held his, unapologetic but honest. "But I will tell you this. Your mother raised a son who stands taller than the man who abandoned him. And she did it alone." Elijah inhaled slowly, his chest tightening, his mother's face flashing in his mind. Catherine turned back to the crowd, her voice regaining its sharp edge. "This is the man you have spent your lives admiring. A man who, when given the choice between responsibility and self-preservation, chose himself. Who, when faced with the consequences of his actions, destroyed a woman's career and ignored his own flesh and blood." She lifted a brow slightly. "And yet, you still invite him into your homes. You still shake his hand. You still trust him with your businesses." The silence that followed was devastating. Randall finally moved, his jaw locking, his breath coming fast. "Catherine." She didn't even look at him. She turned, her back to the man she had spent decades building a life beside, her posture regal, unwavering. Then, finally, she walked away, and just like that, so did everyone else. The executives, the investors, the socialites who had once orbited Randall Whitmore like a fixed star, the people who had spent their lives standing in his shadow. One by one, they turned away. Randall stood alone at the podium, his power, his control, his entire existence reduced to nothing more then a man whose sins had finally caught up to him. Elijah watched as he finally understood. For the first time in his life, Randall Whitmore had been erased, and this time he was the one who couldn't recover. The fallout from the gala was immediate. By the next morning, Randall Whitmore's name was everywhere, but not in the way he was used to. The media had picked up the story before the night even ended. Whispers turning into headlines, speculation turning into cold, hard facts. The great Randall Whitmore, the admired CEO, the philanthropist, the unshakable pillar of the industry, had been publicly outed as a man who had abandoned his own son, destroyed a woman's career, and erased an entire chapter of his past for the sake of his image. And now everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Genesis MedTech had gone silent. No official statement, no desperate attempt to spin the story, just a suffocating pause. But silence only lasted so long, and Randall had to know that his grip on power was slipping. Elijah knew better than to assume the man would go down quietly. Randall had spent his entire life controlling everything and everyone around him. A man like that didn't just disappear, he fought. And Elijah had a feeling he was about to find out exactly what that looked like. He arrived at work later than usual, walking into the building with his head high, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the lingering tension that settled into every corner of the office. He was no longer just an employee, another name on the roster. He was the man who had taken down Randall Whitmore. The moment he stepped onto the R&D floor, he saw Daniel leaning against a workstation, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but expectant. He hadn't called Elijah that morning, hadn't texted, hadn't needed to, because they both knew. Something was coming. "You're late," Daniel muttered, sliding his phone into his pocket. Elijah scoffed, shaking his head slightly. "Figured I'd let you soak in the attention first." Daniel smirked, but it was thin, distracted. His eyes flickered to something over Elijah's shoulder, just for a second, before he straightened. Before Elijah could ask, the door to the lab slammed open. Randall! He stormed in, his presence a force of sheer, unrelenting rage, his body coiled tight, his breathing sharp, his entire being radiating fury. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every single person in the room suddenly became an observer to something they knew they shouldn't be watching but couldn't look away from. Randall didn't care. His eyes were locked on one person, and one person only, Elijah. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't lower his gaze, because he had been waiting for this. Randall's voice was low, sharp, the kind of controlled rage that came from a man who had spent his life getting his way, and now found himself standing in the ruins of what he had built. "You think you've won, boy?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, his lips curling just slightly. "Yeah," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "I do." Randall's nostrils flared, his fingers curling into fists at his sides, his body vibrating with the kind of anger that could no longer be contained. And then he moved. It happened too fast for anyone to react. 1 second Randall was standing across the room. The next he was lunging forward, his arms swinging back, his entire body coiled with the intent to hurt. Elijah barely had time to brace himself. But Randall's fist never connected. Because Daniel was faster. He stepped in, his hand locking around his father's wrist, stopping the punch mid-air, stopping Randall in his tracks. The room stilled. Randall's entire body went rigid, his breath sharp, his eyes wild with uncontained fury. Daniel's grip tightened. His voice, when he spoke, was low, even, but filled with a quiet, dangerous finality. "Try that again," he muttered, his fingers digging into Randall's wrist. "And I swear to God, I'll break your arm." Randall tried to yank free, but Daniel didn't let go. For the first time in his life, Randall Whitmore was powerless, not just in the eyes of the world, not just in the eyes of his employees, his investors, his peers, but in the eyes of his own son. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even more, just enough for only Randall to hear. "You don't scare me, not anymore." Randall's jaw tightened, his face red with rage, humiliation, the unbearable weight of knowing that he had lost control of everything. Then, just as he started to yank back again, a voice from the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore." The room shifted. Elijah turned just slightly, his pulse still thrumming, his breath steady, and found himself looking at two members of the Genesis MedTech board. Randall froze. One of the board members, a tall man with sharp features and an air of quiet authority, exhaled slowly, his voice controlled but firm. "We need to speak with you." Randall's breath was uneven now, his rage flickering into something closer to panic. He looked at Daniel, at Elijah, at the stunned employees still standing around them, watching, absorbing, witnessing, and then, finally, he understood. This wasn't just an outburst. It was evidence. Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly before releasing his grip on Randall's wrist, stepping back just enough to let reality crash down around him. The board member's voice was calm, but absolute. "The footage has already been reviewed." He gestured slightly toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. "There's nothing to discuss." Randall's chest rose and fell sharply. His fingers twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might break. And yet, he said nothing, because he had no defense. The board member's gaze didn't waver. "You'll pack your things and leave the building. Effective immediately." Randall's throat bobbed. The board member lifted a hand, cutting him off before he could even attempt an argument. "This is no longer your company." Randall stilled, and for the first time since this entire thing had begun, Elijah saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, not denial, defeat. Elijah exhaled slowly, shaking his head, watching as Randall Whitmore finally, truly, lost. The great CEO. The man who had spent decades controlling everything and everyone around him. The man who had erased Elijah from existence. Now, he was the one being erased. Randall's fists clenched one last time, his breath coming fast and heavy. But he didn't fight, because it was over. He turned without another word, his steps stiff, heavy, filled with the weight of 22 years of consequences. The board members followed him out. And just like that, Randall Whitmore was gone. A heavy silence settled over the room, the tension still thick, the reality of what had just happened still sinking in. Daniel exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck before turning toward Elijah, his expression unreadable at first, then shifting into something lighter, something easier. "Well," Daniel muttered, shaking his head slightly, "that was satisfying." Elijah let out a quiet breath of laughter, shaking his head. Yeah, it really was. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. The apartment carried a quiet weight that felt different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't the stillness of exhaustion or the quiet that came after an argument. It wasn't the kind of silence that stretched between them when neither knew what to say. This was something heavier, something that settled in the air like a presence, something that acknowledged without words that everything had shifted, and there was no going back. Elijah sat across from his mother at the small kitchen table, the same place they had spent countless evenings, sharing meals, discussing life, carrying on as if the world outside these walls couldn't touch them. But the world had finally come knocking, and now, for the first time, neither of them could pretend otherwise. Naomi had been listening carefully as he spoke, taking in every detail, letting the truth settle in as he walked her through everything. The confrontation at work, the moment Randall had lost control, the way he had lunged at Elijah with nothing but fury and desperation, only to be stopped cold by the son he had once believed would always stand beside him. And when Elijah told her that Daniel hadn't hesitated, that he had stepped between them, that he had made it clear which side he was on, her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, a quiet inhale slipping past her lips, as if she had been bracing herself for anything except that. She hadn't interrupted him once, hadn't asked questions, hadn't even shifted in her seat. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, something between disbelief and reluctant understanding, something that told him she was still trying to accept the fact that Randall Whitmore had finally lost. And now, she was quiet. Elijah exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before leaning back slightly, his fingers drumming absently against the table, waiting for her to say something, to react, to let him know what she was thinking. When she didn't, when the silence stretched a little too long, he let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "Say something." Naomi's gaze flickered slightly, as if she had been lost in thought, as if she had needed a second to pull herself back into the moment. She inhaled slowly, shaking her head, her voice soft but firm, carrying something that wasn't anger, but wasn't quite relief either. "I was right to be afraid." Elijah frowned slightly, straightening. "Mom, I knew this would happen," she continued, her tone measured, her fingers still resting against the table, lightly interlocked. "I knew from the moment you decided to go after him that Randall wouldn't just let it happen, that he wouldn't accept it, that he would fight, that he would lash out. I just didn't expect Daniel to be standing next to you when it happened." Elijah hesitated, because the truth was, neither had he. Not at first. Not when he had first realized who Daniel was. Not when he had told him the truth, expecting denial, expecting resistance, expecting him to walk away, rather than admit that the man who had raised him wasn't the man he had believed him to be. But Daniel had chosen him. Daniel had chosen Elijah over Randall, and that mattered. Naomi exhaled slowly, shaking her head as she studied him, something unreadable flickering across her expression, something between deep concern and quiet acceptance. "I never wanted you to carry this, Elijah. I never wanted you to feel like you had to fight this battle for me." Elijah let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. "I wasn't just fighting for you, Mom." His voice was lower now, steadier, carrying the weight of something that had been building inside him for years. "I was fighting for myself." Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time she didn't immediately have a response, because she understood. She knew he wasn't just some angry son trying to avenge his mother, wasn't just a man seeking justice for something that had happened before he had even been born. He was standing up for the life he had never been allowed to have, for the years he had spent wondering why he was never enough, for the knowledge that Randall Whitmore had never even given him a chance to exist in his world. Before she could say anything, his phone buzzed against the table. Elijah frowned slightly, reaching for it, his stomach tightening when he saw the notification. A message from Daniel. "Daniel, it's done." His chest tightened, his breath steady but slower as he opened the message, his mind already processing what those words meant before he even read the rest. "Daniel, the board just made it official. He's out. Fired. Effective immediately." Elijah exhaled, his fingers tightening slightly around the phone, his gaze scanning over the words again, as if seeing them a second time would make them more real. Randall Whitmore, the man who had spent his life making decisions, controlling narratives, ensuring that no one could ever challenge him, ensuring that no one could take away what he had built, was no longer the CEO of Genesis MedTech. No graceful exit. No chance to salvage what was left. No more power to wield. The man who had spent decades making sure Elijah never had a place at the table had now lost his own seat. Naomi must have seen something in his expression, because she leaned forward slightly, her brows drawing together, her voice quieter but steady. "Elijah!" He swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly before sliding the phone across the table toward her. She hesitated for only a moment before picking it up, her eyes scanning the screen, her breath catching just slightly as she processed what she was seeing. She stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers motionless against the phone, her expression unreadable, as if she had expected this outcome for years, but had never quite let herself believe it would actually happen. Then, slowly, she set the phone down, exhaling a breath that felt heavier than anything Elijah had ever heard from her before. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. Because for the first time since this entire thing had begun, her shoulders relaxed. Not slightly, not a momentary lapse. Fully, completely. Elijah watched as something settled in her, something that had been coiled inside her for years, something that had lived in the back of her mind, something that had whispered to her in the quiet moments, something that had reminded her every single day that Randall Whitmore had taken everything from her. And now? Now, he had nothing left to take. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply before finally looking at Elijah again. And then, for the first time in years, she smiled. Not small, not fleeting, not something polite or forced. A real, full, unrestrained smile. A smile that said she was finally free. Elijah let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as he leaned back, feeling something inside him loosen, something that had been tight for as long as he could remember. Didn't think I'd ever see that again. Naomi huffed out a breath, something light, something real settling into her features, something that felt a lot like peace. Neither did I. Elijah exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with a kind of relief he hadn't realized he was waiting for. Randall Whitmore had spent his life erasing people. Now, he was the one who had been erased. And for the first time, Elijah felt like he had finally reclaimed the space he was meant to have all along. The park was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting warm, golden light over the grass, the air carrying the crispness of the coming evening. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the sounds of children's laughter, the soft murmur of conversations, the rhythmic chirping of birds settling into their nests. It was peaceful, the kind of place that felt separate from everything that had happened, as if the chaos of the past few weeks had never touched it, as if the world itself had already moved on. Naomi sat beside Elijah on a bench overlooking the small lake, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her shoulders relaxed, her expression open in a way that he hadn't seen in years. She had spent most of her life carrying burdens that no one else could see, bearing the weight of someone else's choices, someone else's mistakes, someone else's cowardice. But now, for the first time, that weight was gone. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the air fill her lungs before exhaling slowly, as if releasing something that had been coiled inside her for far too long. "You know," she murmured, her voice quieter now, but not heavy, not burdened, just thoughtful. "I used to come to places like this when you were a baby, when I needed a break, when I needed to remind myself that the world was bigger than what was happening to me." She glanced toward him, her lips tilting slightly. "When I needed to believe that things would get better." Elijah listened, letting her speak, knowing that this was what closure sounded like. She looked out over the lake, her gaze distant but not lost, her voice steadier now. "For a long time, I thought I would always feel trapped by what happened, that no matter how much time passed, no matter how hard I tried to move on, I would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up to me." She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "But it's funny, now that it's over, I don't feel anything for him. No anger, no resentment, not even relief." Elijah turned to her, watching as the light breeze played with the loose strands of her hair, watching as she let herself exist in this moment without looking back. "I think I finally understand," she continued, her voice carrying a quiet certainty, "that he was never as powerful as I thought he was. He only had control because I let him, because I let what he did define me." She glanced at Elijah then, her gaze soft, filled with something warm, something unshakable. "But I won't anymore." Elijah smiled slightly, nodding. "Good." Naomi let out a quiet breath of laughter, shaking her head before looking at him again. "You're a good man, Elijah." She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, her voice lower now, full of something deeper than just pride. "You didn't just fight for me. You fought for yourself, and you won." Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around hers for a moment before he nodded, because he knew she was right. He had spent so much of his life believing that there was something missing, something he had been denied, something he had to prove. But now, sitting here, beside the only parent who had ever mattered, knowing that Randall Whitmore was no longer a shadow looming over them, he realized the truth. He had never been missing anything. He had always had exactly what he needed. And now, for the first time, he could move forward without looking back. As they sat in the fading light, Naomi squeezed his hand one last time before letting go, settling back against the bench, her expression lighter, freer, finally at peace. And Elijah, for the first time in his life, felt completely free. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.